Chapter 28 of The Strange Storybook. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kathrine. The Strange Storybook by Mrs. Lang. Chapter 28. The Princess of Babylon. Belus, king of Babylon, thought himself the greatest man in all the earth, for his subjects were continually telling him so, and he had no difficulty in believing them. It was very absurd, of course, but there is this to be said in his excuse, that though his ancestors had built Babylon 30,000 years before, it owed its chief beauties to him. Belus it was who constructed the vast palace with its famous hanging gardens, and planted with fruit trees a park stretching from the Euphrates to the Tigris, everything being kept fresh and cool in that burning heat by means of canals and fountains which scattered their waters around. But though Babylon contained much that was beautiful, the palace itself held the most beautiful and precious thing of all, the king's only child, the Princess Formosanti, and her father was prouder of her than of his whole empire put together. Still, with all his delight in his daughter's presence, he knew his duty, and that now she was 18 it was needful to find her a suitable husband. Yet who was worthy of such a prize? One by one, Belus passed the kings of the earth in judgment before him, and could not answer this question. Then he remembered that the oracle which had been consulted at Formosanti's birth had declared that only he who could bend the iron bow of Nimrod, the mighty hunter, should win the hand of the princess. Well, since it was the decision of the oracle, which of course must be obeyed, matters became in one way a little easier. But could Belus be mistaken? Had not the oracle said something else? Oh yes, he recollected now that the arm which could draw the bow must overcome also the largest and fiercest lion ever seen in Babylon, and be the best and cleverest and the most splendid of men, and possess the rarest object in the whole universe. And as one by one Belus recalled these conditions, he sighed aloud, for where should he look for a son-in-law like that? King Belus need not have been so anxious as regards suitors for the princess, for as an old song says, "Where maidens are fair, many lovers will come," and Formosanti was very fair indeed. The fame of her beauty had spread far and wide, and soon the court of Babylon received notice that the Pharaoh of Egypt, the Shah of India, and the Khan of Scythia, such were the names these nations gave to their rulers, were on their way to Babylon to ask the hand of Formosanti. Preparations for the great event had to be made instantly, and that very day the place was marked out in the park for the erection of a marble amphitheatre capable of holding 500,000 persons. Opposite the amphitheatre was a high throne for King Belus and his daughter, and on each side, but a step lower, were those for the princes and nobles who might wish to see the contest. The seats for the 3 foreign kings were set a little apart. The first to arrive was the king of Egypt, mounted on the bull Apis, and followed by a train of 8,000 attendants. And scarcely had Belus bidden him welcome than the sound of trumpets announced the approach of the king of India, lying upon cushions in a gorgeous litter drawn by 12 elephants, and attended by a still more numerous company. The last to appear was the king of Scythia, riding a tiger as tall as the biggest horse from Persia. He had with him only a few picked warriors, magnificent men armed with bows and arrows, but the king himself was more imposing than any of his soldiers, and the Babylonians, as they looked at him, said to themselves, "Ah, there is no doubt who will win the princess." When they were all assembled, the 3 monarchs fell on their faces before the king and his daughter, and then offered the gifts they had brought with them. The present of the Pharaoh consisted of 2 of the finest crocodiles that could be caught in the Nile, 2 hippopotamuses, 2 rats, and 2 mummies, all of which caused the princess to shudder at their ugliness. In his hands he held the Book of Hermes, which his magicians assured him was the rarest treasure on earth. The Shah of India brought 100 elephants and a document written by the hand of Kaka himself, while the Khan of Scythia, who could neither read nor write, signed to his warriors to bring forward 100 horses covered with skins of black fox fur. As soon as the offerings had been made, Formosanti bowed modestly, but did not raise her eyes or speak, for that was never expected of a princess. "Ah, why have I not 3 daughters?" exclaimed King Belus, as he conducted his guests to their thrones. "Then I could have made 6 people happy. Now here is a golden basin holding the lots which you must draw. The one who draws the longest first pulls the bow." It was the pharaoh who was the lucky man, and the master of the ceremony stepped forward with a long golden case, bearing the bow of Nimrod. The pharaoh was about to take it from him, when there suddenly appeared at the barrier which had been erected in front of the royal seats a young man, mounted on a unicorn, with a bird upon his wrist, accompanied by a single attendant, also riding a unicorn. His face was fair, and his hair shone like the sun, and altogether he was so different from the dwellers in Babylon that the 500,000 spectators in the amphitheatre rose to their feet in order to stare at him better, and suddenly they shouted with one voice, "He is the only man on earth handsome enough for the princess!" Formosanti heard and glanced up at him, then looked hastily down. The kings heard too and grew pale. At this moment the ushers approached the stranger and inquired if he was a king. The young man replied that he did not have that honour, but that he had travelled far to see whether the suitors who were to present themselves were worthy of Formosanti, whose renown had reached even his distant country. By the king of Babylon's orders, places were found for him and his attendant in the front row of the amphitheatre, his bird perched on his shoulder, and the 2 unicorns crouched at his feet. Now all was ready. The master of the ceremonies, who had during this time been holding the case, took the bow from it to the sound of trumpets and presented it to the king of Egypt. The pharaoh, who had not the slightest doubt that the prize would fall to him, laid it for a moment on the head of the sacred bull Apis and stepped into the middle of the arena. The bow, though made of iron, looked flexible, and he fitted an arrow to the string with a light heart. But try as he would, he could not bend it. Again and again he put forth all his strength, making such dreadful faces the while that shouts of laughter rang through the amphitheatre, and even the well-brought-up Formosanti could not resist a smile. Deeply hurt at his master's failure, the Grand Almoner of Egypt hastened to his side. "Let not your majesty," he said, "struggle further for this empty honour, which is after all only a matter of muscles and sinews. In the other tests you are sure to be the victor. You will conquer the lion, for have you not the sabre of the god Osiris? The princess of Babylon is to be the prize of the king who has given proofs of the greatest intelligence, and numerous are the riddles which you have guessed. Her husband must be the most virtuous of princes. Well, were you not the favoured pupil of the Egyptian priesthood? And do you not possess the 2 rarest objects in the world, the bull Apis and the book of Hermes? Now you are quite safe. There is no one to dispute with you the hand of the Princess Formosanti." "You are right," answered the king, and seated himself on his throne. The bow was next delivered to the king of India, who spent 15 days in vainly trying to draw it, and when he failed as hopelessly as the king of Egypt had done before him, consoled himself with thinking that the king of Scythia would fare no better than they. But he was wrong. The king of Scythia had passed his whole life in shooting with bows and arrows, whereas the other 2 kings had only begun to practice when they heard of the conditions to be fulfilled by the husband of Formosanti. When therefore the Scythian monarch grasped the bow, there was an eager rustle amongst the 500,000 in the amphitheatre. They leaned forward with straining eyes and held their breath like one man as they perceived the slight movement of the bow. The king's heart beat high as he felt it quiver under his hands, but pull as hard as he might, he could not bend it further. A sigh of disappointment swept through the audience, partly for him, and partly for the princess. "At this rate she will never be married," they groaned. Then the young stranger left his seat and went up to the king of Scythia. "Do not be surprised," he said, "if your majesty has not been entirely successful. These bows are made in my country, and there is a certain knack in drawing them. You have won a greater triumph in bending it even a little than I should have done in drawing it altogether." As he spoke, he picked up an arrow, and fitting it into the string of the bow, drew, without any apparent effort, the cord to his ear, and the arrow flew out of sight beyond the barrier. At this spectacle a shout broke from 500,000 throats. The walls of Babylon rang with cries of joy, and the women murmured, "What a comfort that such a handsome young man should have so much strength!" and waited with great interest to see what would happen next. Well, this happened which nobody expected at all. The young man took from the folds of his turban an ivory tablet on which he wrote some lines addressed to the princess with a golden needle, telling her how jealous the rest of the world would be of the man who carried off the prize for which so many were striving. To us who read them, they do not seem, perhaps, to fulfill the second of the conditions imposed, but the oracle knew that to the person whose eyes fell on them for the first time, they would appear to contain all the wit and wisdom of the world. So when the princess glanced at the tablet held out to her at the end of the bow, she felt that nothing more beautiful had ever been written, and the three kings looking on were rooted to the ground in astonishment and disgust. Meanwhile, King Belus, having consulted his magicians, declared that although neither of the three kings could bend the bow, his daughter must nevertheless be married, and that they would now go on to the next test, which was the slaying of the lion. The Pharaoh, who had been educated in all the learning of his country, replied that it was really too ridiculous to expect a king to expose himself to the fury of wild beasts in order to obtain a bride, and that though no one had a greater admiration for the Princess Formosanti than he, yet if he were slain by the lion, he would not be able to marry her any the more. This was quite true, and the King of India entirely agreed with him. Indeed, they went so far as to say that King Belus was making a jest of them, and that it would be necessary to bring large armies from their respective kingdoms in order to punish him. When between them they had dethroned him, they could then draw lots for Formosanti. Thus grumbling, they each sent off a messenger ordering a levy of 300,000 men to be raised without delay. The king of Scythia, however, gave utterance to no complaints, but descended into the arena, a curved sword in his hand. Not that he was desperately in love with the beautiful Formosanti, it was a passion for glory and for no woman which had brought him to Babylon, and when he saw that his two rivals had no intention of fighting the lion, he was filled with delight. He was not afraid of any lion that trod the earth. Of course, he might not be able to kill it, and it might even kill him, but after all, a man could only die once. The lion, when he rushed out from his cage, looked capable of swallowing all three kings at one mouthful, so large and fierce was he. But the king of Scythia stood firm and plunged his sword at the beast's throat. Unluckily, the point of it hit against his teeth and broke into splinters, and the lion, with a roar which shook the amphitheatre to its foundation, buried his claws deep in the thigh of his enemy. Another minute and all would have been over, had not the young stranger leapt to the king's side, and seizing his sword from the belt of an attendant, cut off the lion's head at a single blow. He next produced a little box of ointment, which he begged the king to rub into his wounds. "It was only an accident," he said, "that prevented you from vanquishing the lion, and your courage is still as untarnished as if he lay dead at your feet." These words pleased the king even more than the ointment which was to cure his hurts, and full of gratitude he returned to his tent. Left alone in the arena, the stranger turned to his attendant and bade him wash the lion's head in the stream that ran below the amphitheatre, and when that was done, to take out the teeth of the beast and put in their place diamonds of the same size, which he produced from his sash. As soon as all was ready, the young man said to the bird which had remained perched on his shoulder, "Fair bird, I wish you to carry the head of this lion, and lay it at the feet of Formosanti." So the bird carried the lion's head, bowing himself low before her as he placed it on the ground, and the diamonds in the mouth shone so brightly that the whole court was dazzled with their brilliance. Indeed, the bird itself was hardly less wonderful, with his beak of coral and his claws of silver mixed with purple. No peacock possessed so splendid a tail, and though his size was that of an eagle, his eyes were gentle as well as piercing. The ladies crowded round him to pat his head and stroke his golden feathers, but though he was polite to them all, he would not be tempted away from the princess. Everyone agreed that they had never beheld anything like the grace with which he received the biscuits and pistachio nuts offered him by Formosanti, or the elegant gestures with which he conveyed them to his beak. Meanwhile Belus had been considering attentively the diamonds in the lion's mouth, and had made up his mind about the young stranger. "It is plain," he said, "that he is the son either of the king of China, or of that part of the world known as Europe, or of Africa, which is, I am told, on the borders of Egypt. At any rate, let a magnificent feast be prepared for him." At the same time he ordered his equerry to ask the unknown, with all possible respect, who he was. The stranger was about to answer, when there suddenly arrived on the scene a third unicorn, ridden by a man very plainly dressed. He quickly dismounted, and addressing the victor told him that Omar, his father, had only a short time to live, and that they must start at once if his son wished to see him alive. "Let us go then," replied the young stranger. Then turning to the king he added, "Deign, sire, to permit the princess to accept the bird which I am leaving behind me. They are both of them unique." He bowed to the king and to the spectators and went down the marble steps to where his unicorn was waiting, but not before the equerry had obtained the information desired by Belus and learned that the dying Omar was an old shepherd, much respected in the neighbourhood of his home. Nothing could equal the surprise of Belus and his daughter on hearing this news. In fact, the king refused to believe it, and desired the equerry to ride after the stranger at once, and find out more about him. But the unicorns went like the wind, and no traces could be seen of them, even from the platform of the highest towers. Although the equerry had taken care that his words should be overheard by nobody but the king and the princess, yet somehow the news that the man who had fulfilled all the oracle's conditions was only a shepherd's son speedily leaked out. For a long while no one talked of anything else, as is the way of courts and other places, and it was generally held that it was a bad joke of the attendants, who ought to have known better. One of the ladies in waiting went so far as to explain that the word shepherd might actually mean a king, because kings were set to guard their flocks, but she found no one to agree with her. As to Formosanti, she never said anything at all, but sat silently, stroking her bird. King Belus did not know what to do, and as always happened on these occasions he summoned his council, though he never paid any attention to what they said, or would have said, had they not known it to be useless. He talked to them for some time, and at length decided that he would at once go and consult the oracle as to his best course, and return to tell them the result. When he entered the council chamber after a very short absence, he looked puzzled and crestfallen. "The oracle declares that my daughter will never be married till she has travelled all over the world," said he. "But how can a princess of Babylon who never has stepped beyond the bounds of the park travel over the world? It's absurd. Indeed, if it were not sacrilege to utter such things of an oracle, I should say it was impertinent. Really, the oracle has not a spark of common sense." And the council was of opinion that it certainly had not. Although there was no triumphant bridegroom to grace the feast commanded by King Belus, it was held, as arranged, in the great hall where the turning roof, painted with stars, caused you to feel as if you were dining under the sky. Everything was on a scale of splendor never before seen in Babylon during the 30,000 years of its existence, but perhaps the feast could hardly be considered a success, for the guests neither spoke nor ate, So absorbed were they in watching the incomparable manner in which the bird flew about from one to another, bearing the choicest dishes in its beak. At least, the only people who did speak were the king of Scythia and the princess Aldi, the cousin of Formosanti and scarcely less beautiful than she. To him Aldi confided that it was she who by law should have been queen of Babylon, but that on the death of her grandfather his younger son had usurped her father's rights. However, she ended, in answer to a question put by the king of Scythia, I prefer Scythia with you to Babylon's crown without you. There never was any mistaking what Aldi meant. But I will avenge your father, cried the king. In 2 days from now you shall fly with me back to Scythia, and when I return it will be at the head of 300,000 men. And so it was settled. Everyone was glad to go to bed early after the fatigues of the day, and all slept soundly, except for Mosanti. She had carried the bird with her and placed him on an orange tree which stood on a silver tub in her room, and bidden him good night. But tired as she was, she could not close her eyes, for the scenes she had witnessed in the arena passed one by one before her. At length she could bear it no longer. He will never come back, never, she cried, sobbing. Yes, he will, princess, answered the bird from the orange tree. Who that has once seen you could live without seeing you again? Formosanti was so astonished to hear the bird speak, and in the very best Chaldean, that she ceased weeping and drew the curtains. Are you a magician or one of the gods in shape of a bird? She asked. Oh, if you are more than man, send him back to me. I am only the bird I seem, answered the voice, but I was born in the days when birds and beasts of all sorts talked familiarly with men. I held my peace before the court, because I feared they would take me for a magician. But how old are you? She inquired in amazement. 27,900 years and 6 months, replied the bird, exactly the same age as the change that takes place in the heavens known as the precession of the equinoxes, but there are many creatures now existing on the earth far older than I. It is about 22,000 years since I learned Chaldean. I have always had a taste for it. But in this part of the world, the other animals gave up speaking when men formed the habit of eating them. I never knew they did speak, replied the princess, deeply interested in spite of her woes. Not know that they spoke? Why, the earliest fables all begin with the words, once upon a time when beasts talked. But that is long ago. Of course, many women still talk to their dogs, but the dogs determined not to answer them. They were so angry at being forced by whips to go and hunt their brothers. There are besides many stories which allude to conversations with horses, and their drivers still speak to them, as you know, but so very rudely that the horses which once loved them now hate the whole race. Formosanti nodded her head. She had sometimes been shocked at the language of the Babylonian charioteers. The land where dwells my master, continued the bird, is perhaps the only one in the world where animals are treated with proper respect, and where, therefore, they consent to live happily with man. And where is that? Asked the princess eagerly. It is in the country of the Gangarids beyond the Ganges that Amazon, my master, was born. He is no king. Indeed, I hardly think he would condescend to be one, and like his countrymen, he is a shepherd. But you must not suppose him to be one of the shepherds such as those you know, whose sheep are usually far better dressed than themselves. The shepherds of the Gangarids own immense flocks, for it is considered one of the blackest crimes to kill a sheep, and their wool, as fine as silk, is sought after all over the East. The soil is so rich that corn and fruits grow for the asking, while diamonds can be chipped from every rock. They have no army, and need none, for 100 unicorns can put to flight the largest host that was ever assembled. And now, princess, if you are to travel as the oracle desires, will you not give me the happiness of guiding you thither? Oh, really, answered the princess. The sun was already rising when the king entered his daughter's room, and after receiving the respectful greetings of the bird, sat down on her bed. He did not seem quite at his ease, but at length he informed her that as, greatly to his sorrow, the oracle had decreed that she was to go on a journey before her marriage, he had arranged for her to take a pilgrimage to Araby the Blessed in company with numerous attendants. To the princess, who had never been beyond either the Euphrates or the Tigris, the thought of a journey was enchanting. She could not sit still, and wandered out into the gardens with her bird upon her shoulder. The bird, for his part, was scarcely less happy than she, and flew from tree to tree in an ecstasy of delight. Unluckily, the king of Egypt was strolling about the garden likewise, shooting with bow and arrows at everything within his reach. He was the worst marksman on the banks of the Nile, and though he never by any chance hit what he aimed, he was none the less dangerous for that, as he usually hit something else. In this way a stray shot pierced the heart of the flying bird, who fell all bloody into the arms of the princess. "Burn my body," whispered the bird, "and see that you bear my ashes to Araby the Blessed. To the east of the town of Aden spread them out in the sun, on a bed of cinnamon and cloves." So saying, he breathed his last sigh, leaving Formosante fainting from grief. On seeing his daughter's condition, King Belus was filled with anger against the king of Egypt, and not knowing if the death of the bird might not be a bad omen, hurried as usual to consult the oracle. For answer, the voice to which he looked for guidance declared, "Mixture of everything, living, death, loss and gain, infidelity and constancy, disasters and happiness." Neither he nor his council could make any sense of it, but he was satisfied with having done his duty. Formosante meanwhile had burned the body of the bird as he had desired, and put his ashes in a golden vase from which she never parted. Her next step was to order the strange beasts brought by the king of Egypt to be put to death, and the mummies thrown into the river, and if she could have thrown their master after them she would have received some consolation. When the Egyptian monarch heard how she had treated his offering, he was deeply offended, and retired to Egypt to collect an army of 300,000 men, with which to return and avenge the insult. The king of India promised to do likewise, and the king of Scythia, who had ridden off early that morning with Princess LD, might be expected back about the same time with another army of equal size, to regain his wife's lost inheritance. Thus, when the king of Babylon awoke the following morning, he found the palace quite empty. This he would not have minded, for he was tired of feasting, but his fury was great at the news that the Princess LD had vanished also. Without losing a moment, he called together his council and consulted his oracle, but he only could extract the following words, which have since become famous throughout the world: "If you don't marry your daughters, they will marry themselves." Now, when the Egyptian king quitted the court of Babylon, he left some spies behind him, with orders to let him know the road taken by the princess to reach Araby the Blessed. Therefore, when after 3 days' travelling she stopped at the rest house for a little repose, she beheld to her dismay the king of Egypt following her. And worse than that, in a minute he had placed guards before every door, so that it was useless for her to attempt to escape him. For small though her experience of the world might be, Formosante was well aware that the pharaoh's vanity had been deeply wounded by his failure in the matter of the bow, and she knew she could expect no mercy. Therefore, on receiving the king's message that he craved an interview with her, the princess saw that her only chance lay in cunning, and as soon as he began to speak to her, she knew she had guessed rightly. He addressed her very roughly, and told her that she was in his power, that he intended to marry her that evening after supper, and that it was useless for her to object, as he had now got the upper hand. Formosante pretended to be quite overcome by his kindness, and assured him that in secret he had been the lover she had always preferred, although she was afraid to say so, and she added, with her head hanging modestly down, that she would sup with him that evening with all the pleasure in life, and hoped he would deign to invite his grand almoner also, as he had appeared to her in Babylon to be a man full of wisdom and learning. Further, that she had with her some of the rare and precious wine of Shiraz, which, she trusted, she might be permitted to bring for his Majesty's use. So well did she act that the Pharaoh was completely deceived, and when the hour for supper arrived, he sat down to the table with his wounded vanity soothed and his good temper restored. Anyone acquainted with the ways of princesses will not need to be told that Formosanti not only drugged the wine set aside for the king and the almoner, but also the bottles which her maid distributed amongst the guards. The powder had been given her long ago by a magician in Babylon, with directions how to use it. If, he said, you wish it to take effect at once, put in 2 pinches. If in an hour, 1. If the next morning, 1/4 of a pinch. Remember what I tell you, some day your life may depend on it. For reasons of her own, Formosanti thought it better to get through part of the supper before the king and his guest became unconscious. The Pharaoh was just then well pleased with himself and everyone else, and after paying her compliments on her beauty, which grew more ardent as time wore on, begged permission to give her a kiss. "Certainly, your Majesty," answered the princess, though it was the last thing she desired. But as she bent her forehead towards him, the drug did its work. The king fell back heavily on his chair, the almoner sank sideways to the ground, and a blackbird, which unnoticed by all had been perched in a corner, flew out through the window. Then the princess rose calmly from her seat, summoned her maid, and mounting 2 horses which were saddled in readiness, they rode straight to Araby the Blessed. As soon as she and her maid Urla beheld the town of Aden laying before them, they got down and prepared, as the bird had bidden them, his funeral pyre of cinnamon and cloves. But what was the surprise of the princess when, on scattering the ashes on the little pyre, a flame suddenly broke forth. In the midst of the fire lay an egg, and out of the egg came her bird, more brilliant and beautiful than ever. "Take me to the country of the Gangarids," she gasped when she was able to speak, "and let us find Amazon." Fortunately for the princess, the bird was able to satisfy her. "2 of my best friends among the griffins," he said, "live not far from here. A pigeon shall start at once with a message, and they can be with us by night." And so they were, and the princess and Urla did not lose a moment in mounting a small car which was attached to them, and in setting out for the land of the Gangarids. "I wish to speak to Amazon," cried the phoenix as soon as the griffins halted before his house. And it was as well that the bird was there, for between joy and hope and fatigue the princess's heart was fluttering to such a degree that she could have said nothing. "Amazon," replied the man whose crook betokened him to be a shepherd also. "He went away 3 hours ago." "Ah, that is what I feared," exclaimed the phoenix, while the princess sank back upon her cushions, nearly fainting with disappointment. "Those 3 hours you passed in the rest house may have cost you the happiness of your life. But I will try if anything can be done to repair the mischief. We must see his mother at once," he added, and Formosanti, with hope springing anew within her, followed him into a large room where the air was filled with song, which proceeded from the throats not only of 1,000 different birds, but of shepherds and shepherdesses. The voices seemed to chime in with the melancholy of the princess, who rose, trembling, as the mother of Amazon entered. "Oh, give him back to me," she cried. "For his sake I have quitted the most brilliant court in the world, and have braved all kinds of dangers. I have escaped the snares of the king of Egypt, and now I find he has fled from me." "Princess," answered the lady, "did you not happen to notice while you were at supper with the king of Egypt a blackbird flying about the room?" "Ah, now you say so, I do recollect one," rejoined the princess. "And I remember that when the king bent forward to give me a kiss, the bird disappeared through the window with a cry of anguish." "You are right, alas," replied the lady, "and from that moment all our troubles can be dated. The blackbird had been sent by my son to bring him news of your health, as he meant, as soon as the burial ceremonies for his father had been completed, to return and throw himself at your feet. For when a Gangarid is in love, he is in love. But as soon as he was told how gay you seemed, above all, as soon as he heard of you ready to accept the kiss of the monarch who had killed the phoenix, despair filled his soul, and that in the very moment in which he learned that he was your cousin, and that therefore the king of Babylon might be induced to listen to his suit. My cousin? But how? Never mind that now. He is your cousin, but I feared he would never survive the news of the kiss which you had given to the king of Egypt. Oh, my aunt, if you could only understand, cried the princess, wringing her hands. I dared not excite the king's suspicions, or I should never have escaped. I swear it by the ashes of the soul of the phoenix which were then in my pocket. Tell her, bird of wisdom, that what I say is true. It is, exclaimed the phoenix eagerly. But now what we have to do is to go in search of Amazon. I will dispatch unicorns in all directions, and I hope before many hours to be able to tell you where he is. The phoenix was as good as his word. At length one of the unicorns learned that Amazon was in China. Without losing a moment they set out, and arrived, travelling through the air, in the short space of 8 days, but only to find that they had again missed him by a few hours. The emperor would gladly have kept Formosanti to show her the wonders of his country, but as soon as he heard her story and how all this misery had its root in a kiss given out of pure fidelity, he saw that the one thing he could do for the princess was to discover for her the road which Amazon had taken. From that day began a series of journeys such as no Babylonish princess had ever gone through during the 30,000 years of the monarchy. There was not a kingdom, either in Asia or in Europe, that Formosanti did not visit, and in spite of the fact that she had no room in her mind for any thought except the finding of Amazon, who had invariably left but a few hours before, she was forced to pick up some new ideas on the way. Strange things she saw which her father, King Belus, would never have believed to exist. A country in which the young king had made an agreement with his subjects that the farmer and the noble might sit side by side and make their own laws. Another kingdom in which one man had power to prevent any law from being passed by the rest of the assembly. A third in which the will of one queen had changed the face of the world as if by magic. Though perhaps if the princess had returned for a second visit, she might not have felt so certain that the changes would last. Once it was only a thick fog off an island called Albion, which prevented her vessel from meeting the one containing Amazon, but at length they both found themselves in a province bordering on the Mediterranean, where Formosanti, driven by despair by a rumour that Amazon was faithless to her, was looking out for a ship that might take her to Babylon. As usual, she trusted to the phoenix to make all her arrangements, and the people in whose house she was living, having overheard the bird speaking to her, at once imagined she was a witch, and locked her and her maid Urla in their rooms. They would have seized the phoenix also, but at the sound of the key being turned he quickly flew out of the window and started in search of Amazon. After these long months of wandering, the bird and its master met on the road which runs from north to south, and at first their joy was such that even the princess was forgotten, but not for long. And Formosanti, where is she? A prisoner, alas, on suspicion of being a witch, and you know what that means, answered the phoenix with tears in his eyes. Amazon did know, and for an instant was frozen with horror as the vision flashed across his mind of Formosanti tied to a stake and the flames gathering round her. Then he roused himself and gave the phoenix some orders. In 2 hours help came, and Amazon was kneeling at the feet of the princess. So, united at last, we will leave them. End of chapter 28.
Chapter 29 of The Strange Storybook by Mrs. Lang. This is a LibriVox recording, All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Strange Storybook by Mrs. Lang, Chapter 29, The Adventures of Fire Drill's Son. Read by Aaron Lebowitz. Here is another story of the Tlingit Indians, and in these stories you will often find the raven playing the part of friend and helper, just as the fox does in Japan, and Brer Rabbit in Uncle Remus. The raven is always kinder than anybody else, besides being cleverer, and those who take his advice can never go wrong. One day the raven was flying about, and he saw a girl sitting with her baby in the woods, and he stopped to talk to her. "That is a fine little boy of yours," he said, cocking his head to one side. "Yes, he is," replied the girl, "but I wish he was old enough to get food for us. It is so many years to wait." "That is easily cured," said the raven. "You have only to bathe him every day in the cold spring at the back of these rocks, and you have no idea how quickly he will grow up." So the girl bathed him every morning in the pool, and let the water from the rock pour over him, and it was surprising how soon he was able to help her in work of all kinds, as well as to shoot with his bow and arrows. "Why are we all alone with grandmother?" he inquired at last, for he was fond of asking questions. "Did you never have friends like other people, and have those houses over there always stood empty?" Then they told him that once a large tribe had lived at that place, but they had gradually gone away to hunt or to fish and had never come back. Only the woman and the girl and the baby remained behind. After this the boy was quiet for a time, and for a while he was content to stay at home, only going out in the mornings to bring back a bird from the forest for their dinner. But at length he said to his mother, "If I could only paddle in the lake I could catch you a fish and waterfowl, but all the canoes here are old and broken." "Yes, you must not go out in them. You will get drowned," answered she, and the boy went sadly to his mat to sleep. As he slept, his father, whose name was Fire Drill, appeared to him and spoke, "Take one of those old canoes into the woods, and cover it with bushes. It does not matter how worn out it seems to be, do as I tell you." Then the boy got up and did as his father bade him, and went home again. Early next day, he ran quickly to the place where the canoe was hidden, but found that the old one full of holes had vanished, and the new one, packed with everything he could need, was in its place. While he was admiring it, his father stood before him, and pulled the root of a burnt tree out of the ground, which he turned into a little dog. It was called Gant, or Burnt, and could smell things miles away, and though it was so small, it was strong as a bear. After that, Fire Drill gave his son a fresh bow and arrows, and a great club. Then the boy remembered what his grandmother had said, and he carried the canoe and his father's presents to the wigwam. "I am going away," he told his mother, "and may be absent for 2 days or much longer. Take care of this fire stick, or else if the fire goes out, how will you make it again? Hang it in a safe place on the ceiling, and if I am killed it will fall. So you will know. And now, farewell." Thus speaking, he climbed into the canoe and pushed off. As he went, he saw from afar another canoe coming to meet him, with a man paddling it. "That is the man who killed all my mother's friends," thought he, and he told it to his dog, his club, his bow, and his arrows, for they had the gift of magic and could understand his language. By this time the man had drawn near, and the boy saw that he had only one eye, which was placed in the middle of his face, and that he was more than commonly tall. "Is it you, my nephew?" asked he, and the boy answered, "Yes, it is I." "Where did you come from?" "From my uncle's village." Then the man read what the boy had in his mind, and said, "It was not I who killed your uncles and your mother's friends. It was the East Wind and the North Wind." But the boy did not trust the man's words, and knew that in his heart he wished him evil. And while he was thinking, the big man said to him, "Let us exchange arrows." "Not so," replied the boy. "My arrows are better than yours." And his words were true, for they were all different, and pointed with different things. The The point of one was a porcupine quill, and of another, bark. But the best of all was called Heartstopper, because the moment it touched the man's body, his heart ceased to beat. "My arrows are pointed with sea urchins. Behold how they move," said the man, but again it was not true what he told the boy, for the points were made of weed. "My arrows are not like that," answered the boy. "They are only good for shooting birds." But though he did not trust the man, he never guessed that his desire was to get Heartstopper. They talked for some time longer, and at length the boy lost patience and cried out, "You call yourself my uncle, yet you made away with my mother's friends. Now know that you will never make away with me like that." His words angered the one-eyed man, and, quick as lightning, they both held their arrows in their hands. But the boy was the quickest, and, with the help of the dog, soon killed his enemy. Then he burned the body and paddled on still further, never thinking that his mother at home was wondering why he did not come back. At last he heard a voice calling to him. "That is another bad man," said he, but he paddled to the place where the sound came from, and found a cliff rising straight out of the water. In the middle of the cliff was an opening with a circle of red paint round it, and devil clubs fastened to a ring which was driven into the rock. "Come in! Come in!" cried the voice, and the boy entered and saw a woman there with a knife in each hand. He guessed who she was, and said to her, "I have seen your husband." But she took no heed of his words, and begged him again to enter, and she would give him some food before he went away. "I do not like that sort of food," he answered, as soon as he had seen it, and she exclaimed, "Well, if you want to quarrel, let us fight till one of us is killed." "Willingly," replied the boy, and he heard her go to the rock at the entrance and sharpen the knives in her hands. When she had finished, she threw one of them at him, but he jumped aside, and it stuck in the stool where he had been sitting. Then he seized the knife and threw it at her, and it stuck in her heart, and she died. He let her lie where she fell, and, lifting his eyes, he noticed with dismay that the hole at the end of the cave was quickly growing smaller and smaller. Hastily he snatched up some ermine skins that lay on the ground and tied 2 or 3 in his hair, and shrank himself till he managed to get into one of them, and squeezed through the entrance just before it closed entirely. Once out of the cave, he shot some deer and brought them down in his canoe to his mother and his grandmother, who had spent their time in grieving over him, and wondering if they would ever see him again. "I am all right," he said to them when he got home, "and I have slain the people who put your friends to death." But, in spite of his words, he did not know yet for certain whether the man and woman he had killed had been the murderers of his uncles also, and that he was determined to find out. So he soon went back into the forest and began hunting again. From afar he saw smoke rising up, and he walked towards it till he came to a house. At the door was old mole woman, and very old she was, but her face looked kind and honest, and the boy felt he might have faith in her. "What is it you want, grandson?" she said politely, and the boy answered, "I am seeking for the slayer of my uncles." "It is not easy to get at them," she replied. "It was the hawks that did it, and first you have to find their nests, which are very high up, and next you must wait till the old birds go away, and only the young ones are left." Thus spoke old Mole Woman, and the boy thanked her and set off to find the nest. It took him a long time, but at length he discovered them, and then he hid himself and waited till the parent birds flew off, and the young ones were alone. After that, the boy came out of his hiding place and climbed up the tree, and said to the little birds, "What do you live on?" And the little birds led him to a place that was full of human skulls, and answered, "That is what we live on." "How long will your father and mother be away?" asked the boy. "Till daybreak, but you will not be able to see them, because they come in clouds. My mother flies over the mountain in the yellow cloud, and my father in the black cloud." "Well, I am going now," said the boy, "and take care you do not tell them I have been here, or I will kill you." "Oh, no, no, we will be sure not to tell," cried the little birds, fluttering their wings in the fright. Just as it was getting light, the boy saw the yellow cloud coming fast, and by he made out the mother bird carrying a dead body in her beak. He aimed an arrow at her, and she fell dead at the foot of the tree, and the body fell with her. Soon after, he saw the black cloud coming fast, and when it reached the nest, the father flew out of it and said to the little ones, "Where is your mother?" "Our mother dropped the body she was carrying and fell down after it," answered they, and as they spoke the boy hit him with an arrow, and he fell to the ground also. Then the boy cried out to the little birds, "You must never kill people any more, or live on human flesh. I will go and get food for you until you are strong enough to look after yourselves." And he went out hunting, and he and his dog killed some pigs and brought them to the little birds. And when the little birds grew to be big birds, they killed the pigs for themselves by letting stones fall on their heads, and never more did they eat anything else. After that the boy went back to old Mole Woman. "I have killed the birds," said he, "and because you have helped me I have brought you some food which will last you a long time. Now I must hurry home to my mother and grandmother." Very glad they were to see him again, and for some time he stayed with them and collected grease for candles and provisions of all sorts, enough to last for many, many years. When this was done, he said to his mother, "Mother, I am going to leave you forever, for I was not meant to be with you always, and I have finished that which I set myself to do. If what is hanging overhead should fall, you will know that I am dead, but as long as it remains where it is, do not trouble about me." With that he went out. As he walked along the path, the son of Fire Drill beheld someone in front striding very fast, and the boy chased him till he came first to the Mink people and then to the Marten people. Both of them begged him to stay with them and help them, but he would not, and hurried on after the figure he had seen ahead of him, whose name was Dry Cloud. But when Fire Drill's son came to the Wolf people, they begged him so hard to stop that at last he agreed to do so for a while. Besides, he was very tired and wanted to rest. The Wolf Chief thought much of the boy, then they had a great talk together. One day a large company of the Wolf tribe was present, and they spoke of the beast which could run the fastest. "The swiftest of all is the mountain goat," said one, "and it can jump from rock to rock, and none can come up with it. Tomorrow," he added, turning to the boy, "we are going to hunt them, and if you are there with us, you will see if there is any animal that can outrun a mountain goat." "I will be there," answered the boy. So they started in the morning and hastened to the place, and each tried to be the first to kill one of the goats. But Fire Drill's son's dog got there before any of them, and killed many goats, and the rest galloped away out of reach. Then the wolves went up and carried the dead goats back to their people, and much ashamed they were that the dog had slain them all, and they, the noted hunters, had got nothing. "Men will speak ill of us if they know this day's work," said the wolves, whispering together. "How can we get the better of this son of Fire Drill?" Now one, cleverer than the rest, thought of a plan, and he bade the others cut a quantity of the long stringy creepers that grow in the mountains, and make them into hoops. These hoops they were to roll down the sides of the mountains, and jump backwards and forwards through them, when they were at full speed. It was a good game for their purpose, because anyone who touched the sides of the hoops would be cut in two because of the sharp edges. But the dog guessed this, and said to the boy, "Friend, do not go near those people who are playing. You know nothing of the game, and those things may kill you." "No, I will not play with them, but let us watch them," answered the boy, and they watched them for some time, till the boy said to the dog, "You take one of those rings, and throw it up in the air as high as you can." And the dog took it in his mouth, and stood on his hind legs, and threw it upwards with all his might, and he threw it so high that it never came down again, but stayed up round the moon, where you may still see it any night that there is going to be a change in the weather. And as soon as he heard this, the dog had done, the Wolf Chief called the rest of the wolves, and bade them treat the son of Fire Drill as a friend. "For," he said, "he is a wonderful fellow." A little while after, Fire Drill's son and the wolf went away together. When they had gone a short distance, the wolf raised his head and looked about him. "Some strange creature walks about here," he exclaimed suddenly. "Take my advice and do not try to follow him, or he will have your life." And though he did not say so, the boy felt it was Dry Cloud that the wolf meant. "Don't be afraid for me," he answered. "I only play with him. Well I know that it is impossible to kill him, but it is also impossible for him to kill me, but follow him I must, for this my father bade me. So they set off after a dry cloud, and, curious to say, the swift-footed wolf was forced to run with all his might, while the boy did not seem to be walking faster than usual. Indeed, so rapid was their pace that if in crossing a stream the wolf got his tail wet, he was too tired to shake it himself, and he cried till the boy shook it for him. In this manner they travelled till they came to a house where an old woman lived, and this was the end of their journey for that time, as Dry Cloud lived nearby also, and they could watch him in peace. And while they were there, Fire Drill's son saw a girl whom he thought he would like for his squaw, and he married her, and they had the baby. But when the baby was born, the father shook his head, and said to his wife, "This is going to be a very bad boy." And the fire stick is still hanging on his mother's ceiling. End of chapter 29.
Chapter 30 of The Strange Storybook. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kathleen. The Strange Storybook by Mrs. Lang. The Strange Story of Elizabeth Canning. Are you fond of puzzles? I am. And here is a mystery which all sorts of people have been seeking to explain for 150 years, and nobody, not even the lawyers who have studied it, can make up their minds. So now it is your turn to try. In the year 1752, Elizabeth Canning was a girl of 17, the eldest of a family of 5 children. Her mother was a widow, and very poor. So she was glad when Elizabeth, or Betty, as her friends called her, was old enough to go out to service. Betty was a steady, hard-working young woman, and the neighbors who had known her from a baby were all ready to help her and to get her a suitable place. Her first master was a respectable man who kept a tavern, and in his house she lived for 18 months. But she did not serve the customers, or come into the rooms where they drank. She then left to go as a servant to a carpenter and his wife named Lyon, in Aldermanbury, in the city of London, not very far from her own home. The Lyons were also old acquaintances of Mrs. Canning, and had known Elizabeth since she was 2. Now she was grown up, a rather short, pleasant-looking girl, with a fresh complexion marked with smallpox, but not pretty. Elizabeth had been with the Lyons for 3 months, and had pleased them so well that they promised her a holiday on New Year's Day, 1753, to go to see her uncle and aunt living behind the London docks. So on New Year's Day the girl got up earlier than usual, in order to get her work over as soon as possible. When everything was done, she went up to her attic and took her best clothes out of a chest. She was a long time dressing, but when she stepped out into the street, she felt herself as smart as any maid in London in her purple gown, black petticoat, white apron, a muslin handkerchief folded across her chest, blue stockings, and neat leather shoes. On her head she wore a small, flat, white chip hat bound with green. On her way to the docks she stopped at her mother's, and said that as she had in her pocket 13 shillings given her that morning by her mistress, probably they were her wages, she would ask her aunt Mrs. Cawley to come out with her and buy a cloak. Mrs. Canning made her put the half-guinea in a box, as so small a thing might easily get lost, and then, after presenting each of the children with a penny apiece, except a naughty little brother who had huffed her, she gaily bade them all good-bye and went her way, arriving at her uncle's house about 12 o'clock. Here she had dinner, tea, and supper at 7, when her uncle returned from work, for Cawley, poor man, had no holiday, and at last, without the cloak, which for some reason was never bought, Elizabeth started back to Aldermanbury, the Cawleys walking with her as far as Houndsditch. There they said good night to her soon after 9, and returned home. As far as we can tell, the Lyons must have expected her back quite early in the evening, for when 9 o'clock struck from the church tower close by, the carpenter grew uneasy, and went round to Mrs. Canning to see if Betty was there. No, her mother had not seen her since the morning, but was sure she would be in directly, and Mr. Lyon would most likely find her at home when he got back. But at 10 he paid the good woman another visit, saying he could not imagine what had kept the girl, and at last Mrs. Canning frightened out of her wits, as she herself says, sent 3 of the children out into the fields to look for Elizabeth, and the apprentice went down to the docks to inquire if she was still at her uncle's. It was now midnight, and the collies were so fast asleep that the apprentice had some difficulty in rousing them to listen to his errand. "Betty here?" they asked. "Why, we left her in Houndsditch hours ago." But they do not seem to have felt any alarm till the following morning, when the young man knocked again, and informed them that they could gain no news of the missing girl. Inquiries were made and advertisements were placed in the paper, all in vain. To be sure, a gentlewoman in an oil shop in Bishopsgate declared that she had heard a young voice scream out of a coach on the night of January 1. But as she did not know whether it was a man's or a woman's voice, her information was not of much use. However, vague though it was, Mrs. Canning caught at it eagerly and put it into the advertisement. As to what had become of her daughter, she guessed something different every day. Perhaps she had been kidnapped, or she might have been murdered, or have had an attack of illness. Some years before, part of the ceiling of a garret had fallen on Elizabeth's head and hurt her, so that if anything frightened her she was apt to lose her sense of what was going on for a while. Naturally, when the girl was lost, her mother remembered this and dreaded lest she should have fallen down in some strange place unconscious. Every idea that could come into a person's mind, every accident likely or unlikely that had ever befallen anybody, was, we may feel certain, discussed in the month of January 1753 by Mrs. Canning and her neighbors. She had almost given up hope, and was even in the act of praying to see her daughter's ghost, when Elizabeth at last came. But what an Elizabeth! The apprentice, when he hastened to the door on hearing the latch lifted, did not recognize the girl, and thought it was a woman who had called to ask her way. Then the truth suddenly dawned on him, and he cried out, "Betty has come home!" But as she entered, nearly bent double and walking sideways, holding her hands before her, her mother took her to be indeed the ghost she had prayed for, and, shrieking, "Feel her! Feel her!" sank down in a fit. It was the apprentice and not Mrs. Canning who attended to Elizabeth and placed her in the chimney corner, where she sat exhausted and to all appearance nearly dead. Her mother's first act on recovering from her fit was to send, not for the doctor but for the neighbors, and so many flocked to see the lost girl, that in 2 minutes the room was full, and the apprentice had to stand at the door to keep fresh people out. Of course it was long before anyone thought of putting Elizabeth to bed, and giving her something to eat or drink. Instead, they plied her with questions as to where she had been and what she had been doing, and how she had got in that dreadful condition. To these she replied, telling the same tale which she repeated to Alderman Chitty upon oath 2 days later. On the following morning an apothecary was summoned, and attended her for a week till a doctor was called in, and he for some days thought very badly of her chance for living. But weak and ill as she might be, 2 days after her return home she was brought before Alderman Chitty to tell her story. And this was what she said. After her uncle and aunt had left her in Houndsditch, she was passing along the wall which surrounded the lunatic asylum of Bedlam into Moor Fields, when she was suddenly attacked by 2 men who took all her money from her pocket, and then stripped off her gown and hat. She struggled and tried to scream, but a handkerchief was quickly thrust into her mouth, and she was told that if she made any noise they would kill her. To show that they spoke the truth, one of them did indeed give a blow on the head, and then they took her under the arms and dragged her along Bishopsgate till she lost her senses, as she was apt to do when frightened. She knew no more till she found herself in a strange place, which she had since learned was a house at Enfield Wash, about 11 miles from Aldermanbury. By this time it was about 4 in the morning of January 2. In the kitchen, in which she recovered consciousness, were several people, among them an old woman who asked her if she would stay with her instead of returning home. To this Elizabeth replied, no, she would not, as she wanted to go back to her mother at once. The old woman looked very angry at her answer, and pushed her upstairs into a room, where she cut her stay laces, and took the stays themselves away. She then told her there was bread and water for her if she was hungry, but that was all she would get, adding that the girl had better be quiet, for if she attempted to scream out, she herself would come in and cut her throat. Having said this, the old woman went away, locking the door behind her, and that was the last the girl saw of any human creature for 4 weeks, except the eye of a person who peeped through the keyhole. Left alone, Elizabeth looked about for the food which was provided for her, and found there were some pieces of bread about as much as a quarter loaf, and 3/4 of a gallon of water, or a little more, in a pitcher. She had besides a penny mince pie that she had bought while she was at her uncle's the day before, and intended as a present for her little brother, for, as she said to her mother, the boy had huffed her, and she had not given him a penny like his sisters, so the mince pie was to make up. At this point Chitty seems to have stopped her, and asked her to describe the room in which she was imprisoned, and to tell him what it contained. There was but little furniture of any sort in it, she answered, an old stool or two, an old chair, and an old pitcher over the chimney. The room itself had 2 windows, facing north and east, one of which was entirely boarded up, but the other, though there were some boards on it, was mostly glass. It was through the window at the end of the room that she escaped about 3:30 on the afternoon of Monday, January 29, dropping on to the roof of a shed built against the house, and so to the ground. She knew, it appears, that the road which ran past the house was the one leading from London into Hertfordshire, because she recognized the coachman who had carried parcels for her mistress many a time. Thus, when she escaped, tearing her ear as she did so on a nail outside the window, she had no difficulty in starting in the right direction for London, though after a short distance she became confused, and had to ask the way of several people. She ended by saying that she arrived at home about 10 o'clock very weak and faint, and that her mother gave her some wine, which however she was unable to swallow. Now in those times both lawyers and judges were apt to be very careless, and according to our ideas very dishonest, and Chitty seems to have been no better than the rest. He took, he says, a few notes of the interview with Elizabeth for his own memorandum, but, not thinking it would have been the subject of so much inquiry later, did not take it so distinct as he could wish. Even this paper, which he did show, was not what he had written down at the time when the girl was telling her story, but something that he had pieced together from her own account, and that of various other people who had been present at her mother's 2 nights before, and had gone with her to the alderman, so that no court of law in these days would have thought that Alderman Chitty's account, given more than a year later, of what Elizabeth told him, was to be trusted. In the end, however, Chitty, who declares he had examined her for an hour, and asked her many questions not set down in his paper, granted a warrant for the arrest of one Mother Wells at Enfield Wash, for assaulting and robbing her. Elizabeth herself expressly says she could tell nothing of the woman's name, though she believed she should know her. But one of Mrs. Canning's visitors on the night of the girl's arrival, who was acquainted with Enfield, was certain that the house described could only be that in which Mother Wells lived, and on his information Chitty allowed the warrant for her arrest to be made out. This man, Robert Scarrett, seems to have put to Elizabeth a great many questions which never occurred to the alderman. He asked her, for instance, to describe the woman who had cut off her stays, and she replied that she was tall, black and swarthy, and that 2 girls, one fair and one dark, were with her. This answer surprised him. It was not what he expected. Mother Wells was not a tall, swarthy woman, and he said at once that it could not have been Mother Wells at all, as the description was not in the least like her. On Thursday, February 1, Elizabeth was put into a coach and drove with her mother and 2 other women to Mother Wells' house in Enfield Wash, where they were met by the girls, 2 masters, and several friends. The object of the visit was to prove if the description given by her of the room in which she was confined was correct, and if she could pick out from a number of persons the woman who had cut off her stays and locked her up. As to how far the room, as seen by Elizabeth's friends, at all resembled what she had told them, it is impossible to be certain. It assuredly was very different from the place which Alderman Chitty swore she had described, containing a quantity of hay, old saddles, and other things that the girl had apparently not noticed, even though she had been there a month, while there was no old picture above the mantelpiece, nothing indeed but cobwebs, and there was no grate, though she had sworn she had taken out of it the bedgown or jacket she had come home in. Besides, and this was more serious, there was not a sign of the pent house on which, she said, she had jumped after tearing away the boards at the north window, and one of the witnesses declared that you had only to push open the east window to get out of it with perfect ease, and that he himself had leaned out and shaken hands with his wife, who was standing on the ground which rose on that side of the house. But then the witnesses were not at all agreed among themselves what Elizabeth had really said. So again we are unable to make up our minds what to believe. After she had seen the room, she was taken into the parlor where 8 or 10 people were sitting, and it is curious that now everyone tells the same tale. On one side of the fireplace sat Mother Wells, and on the other Mary Squires. Mary Squires was a gypsy, tall and swarthy, very ill made and extraordinarily ugly, and altogether a person whom it would be impossible to forget. At the time of Elizabeth's entrance she was sitting, crouched up, with a white handkerchief on her head, such as women often wore, and over it a hat, while a short pipe was in her hand. Several more persons were on the same side of the room, in a sort of circle round the fire. Elizabeth glanced towards them. Her eyes rested first on Mother Wells, and then looked past her. "That is the woman who cut off my stays," she said, pointing to the gypsy. At these words Mary Squires rose and came up to the girl, throwing aside her hat and handkerchief as she did so. "Me rob you?" she cried. "I hope you will not swear my life away, for I never saw you. Pray, madam, look at this face. If you have once seen it, you must remember it, for God Almighty, I think, never made such another." "I know you very well," answered Elizabeth. "I know you too well, to my sorrow. Pray, madam, when do you say I robbed you?" "It was on the 1st day of this year," replied Elizabeth. "The 1st day of the new year?" cried the gypsy. "Lord bless me! I was 120 miles away from this place then, at Abbotsbury in Dorsetshire, and there are 100 people I can bring to prove it." But no one at that time paid any attention to her words, or thought of allowing her to prove her innocence. Elizabeth, with 2 girls found in Mother Wells' house, were examined before Henry Fielding, the novelist author of Tom Jones, then a magistrate of London, who showed, according to his own account, gross unfairness in dealing with the matter, and by him the case was sent for trial at the Old Bailey. Elizabeth repeated the story she had told from the first, with the result that the gypsy was condemned to be hanged, and Mother Wells to be branded on the hand and to go to prison for 6 months. Luckily, however, for them, the president of the court that tried them was the Lord Mayor Sir Crisp Gascoigne, a man who had more sense of justice and fair play than many of his fellows. He did not feel sure of the truth of Elizabeth's tale, and never rested till both the women were set at liberty. This made the mob very angry. They were entirely on Elizabeth's side, and more than once attacked the Lord Mayor's coach. Other people were just as strong on behalf of the gypsy, and things even went so far that often the members of the same family declined to speak to each other. Then came Elizabeth's turn. In April 1754 she was arrested on a charge of perjury or false swearing, and sent to stand her trial at the Old Bailey. Now was Mary Squires' opportunity for calling the 100 people to prove that she, with her son George and daughter Lucy, was down at Abbotsbury, in Dorsetshire, on January 1, 1753, at the moment that she was supposed to be cutting off the stays of Elizabeth Canning at Enfield Wash. And if she did not quite fulfill her promise, she actually did summon 36 witnesses who swore to her movements day by day from December 29, 1752, when all 3 squires stopped at an inn in South Parrot in Dorsetshire, to January 23, 1753, when Mary begged for a lodging at Page Green. Now Page Green was within 2 or 3 miles of Enfield Wash, where the gypsy admitted she had stayed at Mother Wells' house for 10 days before Elizabeth Canning had charged her with robbery. Her denial of the accusation was further borne out by a man and his wife, who appear in the reports as Fortune and Judith Natus. He was quite plainly called Fortunatus, after the young man with the fairy purse, both of whom declared upon oath that they had occupied the room in which Elizabeth stated she had been confined for 10 or 11 weeks at that very time, and that it was used as a hayloft. Mary Squires had called 36 witnesses to prove an alibi, in other words, to prove that she had been present somewhere else, but Elizabeth's lawyers produced 26, stating that they had seen her about Enfield during the month when Elizabeth was lost. This was enough to confuse anybody, and many of the witnesses on both sides were exceedingly stupid. To make matters worse and more puzzling, not long before a law had been passed to alter the numbering of the days of the year. For instance, May 5th would suddenly be reckoned the 16th. A fact it was almost impossible to make uneducated people understand. Indeed, it is not easy always to remember it oneself, but it all helps to render the truth of Elizabeth's tale more difficult to get at. For you never could be sure whether, when the witnesses said they had seen the gypsy at Christmas or New Year's Day, they meant Old Christmas or New Christmas, Old New Year's Day or New New Year's Day. Yet certain facts there are in the story which nobody attempts to contradict. It is undisputed that a young woman, weak and with very few clothes on, was met by 4 or 5 persons on the night of January 29, 1753, on the road near Enfield Wash, inquiring her way to London, or that on the very same night Elizabeth Canning arrived at home in Aldermanbury, in such a state that next morning an apothecary was sent for. Nor does anyone, as we have said, deny that she picked out the gypsy from a number of people as the person who assaulted her. All this is in favor of her tale. Yet we must ask ourselves what possible motive Mary Squires could have had in keeping a girl shut up in a loft for 4 weeks, apparently with a view of starving her to death. Elizabeth was a total stranger to her. She was very poor, so there is no hope of getting a large ransom for her. And if she had died, and her kidnapping had been traced to Mary Squires, the gypsy would have speedily ended her days on the gallows. On the other hand, if Mary Squires did not know Elizabeth Canning, Elizabeth equally did not know Mary Squires, and we cannot imagine what reason Elizabeth could have had in accusing her falsely. Only one thing stands out clear from the report of the trial, and that is that Elizabeth was absent during the whole of January 1753, and that she very nearly died of starvation. Guilty of perjury, but not wilful and corrupt, was the verdict of the jury, which the judge told them was nonsense. They then declared her guilty, and Elizabeth was condemned to be transported to one of His Majesty's American colonies for 7 years. We soon hear of her as a servant in the house of the principal of Yale University, a much better place than any she had at home. At the end of the 7 years she came back to England, where she seems to have been received as something of a heroine, and took possession of £500, which had been left her by an old lady living in Newington Green. She then sailed for America once more, and married a well-to-do farmer called Treat, and passed the rest of her life with her husband and children in the state of Connecticut. Up to her death, which occurred in 1773, she always maintained the truth of her tale. Was it true? The lawyers who were against Elizabeth said, at her trial, that as soon as she was found guilty, the secret of where she had been would be revealed. It never was revealed. Now several persons must have known where Elizabeth was. All the world heard her story, yet nobody told where she had been. If the persons who knew had not detained and ill-used the girl, there was nothing to prevent them from speaking. Yet to the end we shall ask, why did Mary Squires keep her at Enfield Wash, if she did keep her? End of The Strange Story of Elizabeth Canning. Chapter 31 of The Strange Storybook. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kathleen. The Strange Storybook by Mrs. Lang. Mrs. Veal's Ghost. Now you are going to hear a ghost story published, but he says, not written, by Daniel Defoe, the author of Robinson Crusoe. If you read it carefully, you will find how very curious it is. Miss Veal, or as she was then called, according to custom, Mrs. Veal, was an unmarried lady of about 30 living with her only brother in Dover. She was a delicate woman, and frequently had fits, during which she would often stop in the middle of a sentence and begin to talk nonsense. These fits probably arose from not having had enough food or warm clothes in her childhood, for her father was not only a poor man, but also a selfish one, and was too full of his own affairs to look after his children. One comfort, however, she had in a little girl of her own age, named Lodowick, who often used to bring her neighbor half of her own dinner, and give her a thick wadded tippet to wear over her bare shoulders. Years passed away, and the girls grew to women, meeting as frequently as of old, and reading together the pious books of the day. Drelincourt upon death being perhaps their favourite. Then gradually a change took place. Old Veal died. The son was given a place in the customs, and his sister went to keep house for him. She was well to do now, and had no longer any need of a friend to provide her with food and clothes. And little by little she became busy with her new life, and forgot the many occasions on which she had exclaimed gratefully to her playfellow, "You are not only the best, but the only friend I have in the world, and nothing shall ever loosen our friendship." Now she visited in the houses of people who were richer and grander than herself, and sought out her old companion more and more seldom. So that at length, when this story begins, 2 years and a half had passed by without their having seen each other. Meanwhile, though Mrs. Veal, in spite of a few love affairs, had remained a spinster, her friend had married a Mr. Bargrave, and a very bad match he proved, for the way in which he ill-used his wife soon became known to everyone. They left Dover about a year after Mrs. Bargrave's last visit to Mrs. Veal, and several months later they settled in Canterbury. It was noon on September 8, 1705, and Mrs. Bargrave was sitting alone in an armchair in her parlour, thinking over all the misery her husband had caused her, and trying hard to feel patient and forgiving towards him. "I have been provided for hitherto," she said to herself, "and doubt not that I shall be so still, and I am well satisfied that my sorrows shall end when it is most fit for me." She then took up her sewing, which had dropped on her lap, but had hardly put in 3 stitches when a knocking at the door made her pause. The clock struck 12 as she rose to open it, and to her profound astonishment admitted Mrs. Veal, who had on a riding dress of silk. "Madam," exclaimed Mrs. Bargrave, "I am surprised to see you, for you have been a stranger this long while, but right glad I am to welcome you here." As she spoke, she leaned forward to kiss her, but Mrs. Veal drew back, and passing her hand across her eyes, she answered, "I am not very well," adding after a moment, "I have to take a long journey, and wished first to see you." "But," answered Mrs. Bargrave, "how do you come to be travelling alone? I know that your brother looks after you well." "Oh, I gave my brother the slip," replied Mrs. Veal, "because I had so great a desire to see you before I set forth." "Well, let us go into the next room," said Mrs. Bargrave, leading the way to a small room opening into the other. Mrs. Veal sat down in the very chair in which Mrs. Bargrave had been seated when she heard the knocking at the door. Then Mrs. Veal leaned forward and spoke. "My dear friend, I am come to renew our old friendship, and to beg you to pardon me for my breach of it. If you can forgive me, you are one of the best of women." "Oh, don't mention such a thing," cried Mrs. Bargrave. I never had an unkind thought about it, and can most easily forgive it. What opinion can you have had of me?" continued Mrs. Veal. "I supposed you were like the rest of the world," answered Mrs. Bargrave, "and that prosperity had made you forget yourself and me." After that they had a long talk over the old days, and recalled the books they had read together, and what comfort they had received from Drelincourt's Book of Death, and from 2 Dutch books that had been translated, besides some by Dr. Sherlock on the same subject. At Mrs. Veal's request, Mrs. Bargrave brought Drelincourt's discourses down from upstairs, and handed it to her friend, who spoke so earnestly of the consolations to be found in it that Mrs. Bargrave was deeply touched. But when Mrs. Veal assured her that in a short time her afflictions would leave her, Mrs. Bargrave broke down and wept bitterly. "Are you going away and leaving your brother without any one to look after him?" asked Mrs. Bargrave as soon as she could speak. "Oh no, my sister and her husband had just come down from town to see me, so it will be all right," answered Mrs. Veal. "But why did you arrange to leave just as they arrived?" again inquired Mrs. Bargrave. "Surely they will be vexed." "It could not be helped," replied Mrs. Veal shortly, and said no more on the subject. After this, the conversation, which continued for nearly 2 hours, was chiefly carried on by Mrs. Veal, whose language might have been envied by the most learned doctors of the day. But during the course of it Mrs. Bargrave was startled to notice Mrs. Veal draw her hand several times across her eyes, as she had done on her entrance, and at length she put the question, "Mrs. Bargrave, don't you think I look much the worse for my fits?" "No," answered Mrs. Bargrave, "I think you look as well as ever I saw you. I want you to write a letter for me to my brother." "Then," said Mrs. Veal, "and tell him to whom he is to give my rings, and that he is to take 2 gold pieces out of a purse that is in my cabinet, and send them to my cousin Watson." Cousin Watson was the wife of a Captain Watson who lived in Canterbury. As there seemed no reason that Mrs. Veal should not write the letter herself, the request appeared rather odd to Mrs. Bargrave, especially as then and afterwards it was the custom for people to leave rings to their friends in their wills. These rings contained little skulls in white enamel, and the initials in gold of the dead. Mrs. Bargrave wondered if her friend was indeed about to suffer from one of her attacks, so she hastily placed herself in a chair close by her, that she might be ready to catch Mrs. Veal if she should fall, and, to divert her visitor's thoughts, took hold of her sleeve and began to admire the pattern. "The silk has been cleaned," replied Mrs. Veal, "and newly made up," and then she dropped the subject and went back to her letter. "Why not write it yourself?" asked Mrs. Bargrave. "Your brother may think it an impertinence in me." "No," said Mrs. Veal, "it may seem an impertinence in you now, but you will discover more reason for it hereafter." So to satisfy her, Mrs. Bargrave fetched pen and ink, and was about to begin when Mrs. Veal stopped her. "Not now," she said, "wait till I am gone, but you must be sure to do it," and began to inquire for Mrs. Bargrave's little girl, Molly, who was not in the house. "If you have a mind to see her, I will fetch her home," answered the mother, and hastily ran over to the neighbour's where the child was. When she returned, Mrs. Veal was standing outside the street door, opposite the market, which was crowded, the day being Saturday and market day, waiting to say good-bye to her. "Why are you in such a hurry?" inquired Mrs. Bargrave. "It is time for me to go," answered Mrs. Veal, "though I may not start on my journey till Monday. Perhaps I may see you at my cousin Watson's before I depart, whither I am hastening." Then she once more spoke of the letter Mrs. Bargrave was to write, and bade her farewell, walking through the market-place till a turning concealed her from view. It was now nearly 2 o'clock. The following day Mrs. Bargrave had a sore throat, and did not go out, but on Monday she sent a messenger to Captain Watson's to inquire if Mrs. Veal was there. This much astonished the Watsons, who returned an answer that Mrs. Veal had never been to the house, neither was she expected. Mrs. Bargrave felt sure that some mistake had been made, and, ill though she was, put on her hood and walked to the Watsons, whom she did not know, to find out the truth of the matter. Mrs. Watson, who was at home, declared herself unable to understand why Mrs. Bargrave should imagine that Mrs. Veal should be in their house. She had never been in town. Mrs. Watson was persuaded, as if she had, she would certainly have called on them. It was to no purpose that Mrs. Bargrave assured the good lady that Mrs. Veal had spent 2 hours with her on the previous Saturday. Mrs. Watson simply refused to believe it. In the midst of the discussion, Captain Watson came in and announced that on the previous Friday, September 7, 1705, at noon, Mrs. Veal had died of exhaustion after one of her fits, and that even at that moment the big painted board with the family coat of arms, called by Captain Watson an escutcheon and by us a hatchment, was being painted in Canterbury. When finished, it would be taken to Dover and hung up in front of the Veals' house. Mrs. Bargrave found the captain's story impossible to believe, and she went off immediately to the undertaker's shop, where the escutcheon was shown her. Not knowing what to think, she next hastened back to the Watsons, and told the whole tale of Mrs. Veal's visit, describing every particular of her appearance and silk habit, which Mrs. Veal had specially mentioned was scoured. On hearing this, Mrs. Watson cried out excitedly, "Then you must indeed have seen her, as I helped her myself to make it up, and nobody but she and I knew that it was scoured." In this way the Watsons' doubts of the appearance of Mrs. Veal were set at rest, and the story was soon blazed all about the town by the lady, while the captain took 2 of his friends to Mrs. Bargrave, in order that they might listen to her own account of the strange circumstance, which she gave in exactly the same words as before. Very soon her house was besieged by all sorts of people interested in the story, who saw that Mrs. Bargrave was a straightforward, cheerful person, not at all likely to have invented such a surprising tale. Amongst those who visited Mrs. Bargrave was the lady whose account was published by Defoe in 1706. Their houses were near together, and they had known each other well for many years. It is she who tells us of various little facts which go far to prove the truth of Mrs. Veal's apparition. How it was discovered that the sister and brother-in-law to whom Mrs. Veal referred really had travelled from London to Dover in order to pay their family a visit, but only arrived just as Mrs. Veal was dying. How the servant next door, hanging out clothes in the garden, had heard Mrs. Bargrave talking to someone for above an hour at the very time Mrs. Veal was said to be with her, and how immediately after Mrs. Veal had departed, Mrs. Bargrave had hurried in to the lady next door, and told her that an old friend she feared she had lost sight of had been to see her, and related their conversation. But Mrs. Veal's brother in Dover was very angry when he heard what was being said in Canterbury, and declared he should go and call on Mrs. Bargrave, who seemed to be making a great deal out of nothing. As to the little legacies which Mrs. Bargrave had mentioned in her letter that Mrs. Veal wished him to give to her friends, why, he had asked his sister on her deathbed, for she was conscious for the last 4 hours of her life, whether there was anything she desired to dispose of, and she answered, no. But, in spite of Mr. Veal's wrath, everyone believed in Mrs. Bargrave's tale, for they believed in Mrs. Bargrave herself. She had nothing to gain by inventing such a story, and was ready to answer all questions put to her in a plain, straightforward way. "I asked her," said the lady from whom Defoe obtained his account, "if she was sure she felt the gown. She answered, 'If my senses are to be relied on, I am sure of it.' I asked her if she had heard a sound when Mrs. Veal clapped her hand upon her knee. She said she did not remember that she did, but added, 'She appeared to be as much a substance as I did who talked with her, and I may be as soon persuaded that your apparition is talking to me now as that I did not really see her, for I was under no manner of fear. I received her as a friend and parted with her as such. I would not,' she concluded, 'give 1 farthing to make anyone believe it, for I have no interest in it.' From Defoe's day to this many people have read the tale, and several have held it to be a pure invention of the novelist, but some have taken the trouble to search out the history of the persons mentioned in it, and have found that they at any rate were real, and living in Dover and in Canterbury at the very dates required by the story. In the reign of Charles I, a Bargrave had been Dean of Canterbury, and a Richard Bargrave married a widow in the church of St. Elphege in 1700. There had been also Veals connected with Canterbury, which is curious, and we find that a son of William Veal was baptized in St. Mary's, Dover, in August 1707. Now, as Mrs. Veal kept her brother's house when they moved into Dover, he must have married after his sister's death on September 7, 1705, and if we turn over the parish register of that very year, we will see the burial of a Mrs. Veal on September 10. The Watsons are also to be found in Canterbury, and an old Mr. Breton in Dover, who was known to have given Mrs. Veal £10 a year. Of course it does not follow from this that, because the characters of the tale published by Defoe only 10 months after Mrs. Veal's death were actually alive in the very places where he said we should find them, Mrs. Veal's ghost did really appear to Mrs. Bargrave. But if not, why drag in all these people to no purpose? They could all have contradicted him, but the only person who did so was Mr. Veal himself, and he alone had a motive in disbelieving the appearance of his sister, as he may not have wished to hand over the rings which she had bequeathed to her friends, or to diminish the contents of the purse of gold he was driven to admit that she possessed. Once more, it is perfectly certain that Mrs. Bargrave told and stood by her story, for in May 1714 a gentleman went to see her and cross-examine her. Mrs. Bargrave said that she did not know the editor of her story, but that it was quite correct except in 3 or 4 small points. For instance, that she and Mrs. Veal had talked about the persecution of dissenters in the time of Charles II was omitted in the printed version. The gentleman then made the corrections by his copy of the book, and added a long note in Latin about his visit to Mrs. Bargrave on May 21, 1714. This copy of the book Mr. Aiken found in the British Museum, so whether we believe Mrs. Bargrave's story or not, she undoubtedly told it, and it was not invented by Defoe. The facts were discovered by Mr. G. A. Aiken, who published them in his edition of Defoe's tales. He does not seem to have known that in an old book, Dr. Wellesby's Signs Before Death, there is another version, with curious information about Mistress Veal's broken engagement with Major General Syborg, killed in the Battle of Mons, and about the kinship of the mother of Mrs. Veal with the family of the Earl of Clarendon, which induced Queen Anne, moved by Archbishop Tillotson, to give Mr. Veal his place in the customs. We also learn that Mrs. Bargrave's cold on the Sunday was caused by the conduct of her husband, who came home intoxicated, found her excited by her interview with Mrs. Veal, and saying, "Molly, you are hot, you want to be cooled," led her into the garden, where she passed the night. End of Mrs. Veal's Ghost.
Chapter 32 of The Strange Storybook by Mrs. Lang. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Omar H. Eldahan. The chief's daughter. Raven's wife had died, and as he felt very lonely, he soon determined to marry a second. But it was not very easy to find a girl to suit him, for she was obliged to be of noble birth, as the other had been. And to add to the difficulties, a mischief-maker called Sagwan was also seeking a wife of the same kind. And wherever Raven went, Sagwan flew after him, and told untrue stories about Raven, so that fathers refused to give him their daughters. At last, Raven discovered this and went straight to the chief of the town. "I know what has happened," said he, "and you will suffer for it. If I had married your daughter, you would have had a great name in the world, But now your daughter will marry someone whom no one ever heard of, and if they speak of you among men, it will as be the chief with no name." When he heard this, the chief trembled, for he knew it would be shameful. So Raven left him and continued his journey, till he reached the house of an old man who lived alone. "Do you know the young daughter of the chief who lives not far from here?" he asked.
"Yes, I know her."
"Well, why don't you marry her?"
"Oh, it is quite impossible that I should marry her, so I don't see the good of trying."
"Don't be so faint-hearted," said Raven. "I will give you a medicine which will cause her to fall in love with you."
"But I have no slaves."
"And she will expect slaves," said the old man. "Oh, no, she won't," answered Raven. "She will take a liking to you, and no one will be able to help it. She will marry you, and her father will lose half his property." And Raven kept his word, and his medicine made the old man look young again. And Raven bestowed feathers on him to put in his hair, and a robe of marten skin to throw over his shoulders. When he was dressed, the man looked very handsome and was greatly pleased with himself. But his face fell when Raven said to him, "Remember, you are not going to be like this always. It is only for a day or two." Then the man got into his skin canoe and paddled over to where the girl lived. And he did not go to ask her father's consent, but sought her out when she was alone. And she fell in love with him, although she had refused to listen many other men besides Raven, and this was Raven's revenge. "Yes, I will marry you," she said, "and I will go with you, even if my father kills me for it." So she married him, and after that her father and mother were told of it. But the chief, instead of being unkind to his daughter, gave her rich fur robes.
"For," said he, "if she is already married, there is no use in my being angry. And besides, her husband is a handsome fellow and is plainly of high birth."
And he and the husband talked together of his daughter's suitors, and especially of the man who had been cruel to his first wife. But the husband did not know that the chief meant Raven. The new husband was anxious to get back to his own home, as he was afraid that his fine clothes might drop off him on the way. Therefore he lost no time in saying,
"My father told me I was to return at once in my canoe. Let us hasten. But do not you, my wife, take any furs with you, except those you want to keep you warm on the journey, for I have more than enough in my house."
The wife obeyed him, and only took with her a marten skin and a fox robe. Now the girl lay in the canoe with her eyes shut, and she lay there for a long while, till she thought that they must be near home. Then she sat up and looked out, and caught sight of her husband's face, which looked quite different from when she had seen it before. For now it was full of wrinkles, and the hair was thin and grey, and at the sight her heart beat so fast it seemed as if it would jump out of her body, and she cried very bitterly, because she was frightened and angry. As soon as the canoe ran upon the beach, she sat upon the rocks weeping, while the old man went from house to house throughout the village, begging them to take her in, as she was a high-born girl, and he had no place that was fit for her. But they would not. And at last his sister, who was still older than he, came down to the beach, and took the girl back to her house, which was dirty and shabby. The girl went, but she was very miserable, and every day the people stopped as they were passing, and mocked at her and her husband. Curious to say, the chief and his sons had been quite deceived by the fine clothes of the daughter's husband, and resolved to make him presents suited to his rank. Therefore, one day the people of the village beheld a procession of canoes paddling over the sea, one filled with furs, another containing the father and brothers of the girl, and a third in which sat the slaves, with green feathers in their hair, taken from the heads of drakes. The old man saw them likewise, and called to some boys to come and help him clean up the house. But they only answered, "Clean up yourself, for you are dirty enough."
"Well, at least carry up the strangers' goods. They are now landing," said he.
But the boys replied that they had done before, "Carry them yourself." In the end, it was the strangers who carried them, and put them down where they could. And they noticed that the old man's sister was crying, and the strangers felt sorry for her. The old man soon found that he would get no help from anybody, for they were all angry with him for having married a chief's daughter. If he asked them to lend him a basket for his guests to eat off, they told him to use his own. If he begged them to fetch water, they bade him get it himself. And even when he took a very dirty old basket to fill at the stream, as he stopped down the water moved a little further away, and then a little further still, as if it also had a spite at him. Indeed, it did this so often that at last he found himself in the mountains, where it vanished into a house. Once more he followed it, and beheld a very old woman sitting inside. "What is the matter?" said she. "Is there anything I can do for you?"
"You can do a great deal for me, if you only will," answered he. "I am very poor, and have married a noble wife, whose father and brothers have come to visit me. I have nothing to give them, and my neighbors will not help."
"Is that all?" she said.
"Yes, all. Is it not enough?"
But the old woman only smoothed his hair with her hand, and in a moment it was thick and black, as it had been in his youth, and his rags became handsome garments. Even the very basket changed into a beautiful new one. "Go and dip the basket into the spring that is in the corner," said she, and when he drew it up, it was full of water and of shells. The man made all the haste he could down the mountain, but nobody recognized him except his wife, and those who had seen him when he went to marry her. He refreshed them all with water and gave them handfuls of shells, which they prized greatly, in return for the slaves and furs his father-in-law had presented to him, for it is the custom of that tribe that if a man receives a gift from a father-in-law, he shall pay it back with something of much greater value. And he soon grew so rich that the people made him chief of the town. Now that happened which was bound to happen. The people who had mocked him when he was poor were ready to bow down to him when he was rich, while he and his wife grew harder and prouder every day. They built themselves a large house where they gave magnificent feasts, but they passed most of their time on the roof of the house, watching all that went on below. One fine spring evening, they were sitting there as usual, when a flock of swans flew across the sky from the southeast. "What beautiful birds! I should like to marry one of them," exclaimed the wife, as the swans gradually disappeared in the distance. Of course, she did not mean anything any more than when she repeated the same words on seeing the sand cranes overhead, or the brants which presently came past. But the brants did not know this, and as soon as they heard her they flew down and carried her off on their wings. Her husband ran after them, but he never reached them. Only now and then she let fall some of the loose clothes that covered her. By and by, for they found she was heavier than they expected, the brants let the woman fall too. Luckily, they were then over the sandy beach, so she was not hurt, but she was quite naked, and even her hair had been rubbed off. She got up and walked quickly, crying as she went, to some trees which had large leaves, and these she twisted together till she had made a kind of apron. Then she wandered along the beach, not knowing where she was going, and thinking sadly of her home and her husband, till she came to a house with an old woman sitting in it. The sight gladdened her heart, and she entered and held out the head of a red snapper, which she had picked up on the shore, saying, "Let us cook this red snapper head for dinner." "Yes, let us cook it," answered the old woman. And after they had eaten it, she bade the chief's wife to go back to the beach and try to find something else. This time the girl brought in a fish called a sculpin, and it was cooked also. But while they were eating it, the chief's wife heard the noise of boys shouting, though she could see no one. "Take the tray with the food out to that hole," said the old woman, and as the chief's wife did so, she beheld many hands sticking up out of the ground. She placed the tray in the hands and waited as it disappeared. In a moment it rose to the surface again, with 2 fine fox skins on it, which she carried back to the old woman. "Make yourself some robes out of them," said she, and the girl did so. When she was dressed, the old woman spoke again to her, and said, "Your father and mother live in a salmon creek, a little way along the beach. It might be well for you to go and pay them a visit." So the girl went, and after a time she saw her father out in a canoe spearing salmon, and her mother was with him. The girl ran quickly down to the water's edge in order to meet them, but when her father saw her, he cried out,
"Here comes a fox. Where are my bow and arrows?"
And his daughter heard him and ran as fast as she could to the woods. After a while she stopped running, for she knew she was safe, and then she made her way to the old woman. "Why are you crying? Did you not see your father?" "Yes, and he took me for a fox." "Why, what else do you think you are?" asked the old woman in surprise. "But return at once to your father, who will want to kill you, and be sure you let him do it." "Very well, I will do your bidding," answered the girl, though the order seemed strange to her. The next day the girl went down to the beach and saw her father fishing still closer to the shore.
"Why, here is that big fox again," cried he,
and she did not move, but waited while he fitted an arrow to his bow and shot her in the heart. Then his wife got out of the canoe and began to skin the fox, and as she did so she found something on its foreleg which made her start. "Surely that is my daughter's bracelet," said she. "Yet that is not possible," and she continued her work. By and by she came to the throat, and there lay a necklace. "Surely that is my daughter's necklace," she repeated, and then she called her husband, saying, "I found our daughter's necklace and bracelet in the skin. Something that we know not of must have turned her into a fox." And they both cried, for they remembered how the fox had run to meet them instead of going away. But Indians are learned in things of which other people are ignorant, and they quickly set to work and laid the fox's body on a mat, and covered it with bags of eagle's down which every tribe has ready to use, and over all they placed a mat, weeping as they did so. After that they fasted and cleaned up their houses, and the girl's relations fasted likewise and cleaned up their houses. For many days they did this, and at length, at midnight, the father and mother felt their house shaking beneath them, and heard a noise coming from the room where the body lay. Taking a burning stick, the mother hastened to the room, and found her daughter in her own shape, having become a doctor or shaman. Happy indeed were they to behold her thus, but curious to say, the girl's husband at that moment lost all his wealth, and was as poor as ever. End of chapter.
Chapter 33 of the Strange Storybook. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by 3Dead. The Strange Storybook by Mrs. Lang. Chapter 33. The Boyhood of a Painter. If we are to believe the proverb, a jack of all trades is master of none, and it is mostly true. But here and there, even in our own day, we meet with some gifted person who seems to be able to do anything he desires, and during the periods of history when men and boys were left more to themselves and allowed to follow their own bent, these geniuses were much less rare than at present. Now, during the last half of the 15th century and the first half of the 16th, there lived in Italy a group of men who were in the highest possible degree jacks of all trades, or could have been if they had chosen. They are known to us principally as painters, but the people amongst whom they lived very soon became aware that more than one of them could arrange you a water supply with which you could turn your mill wheel if there was no stream handy, or build you a palace if you were a rich citizen and wanted one, or help you fortify your walls if you were the lord of Milan or Florence or Ferrara, or fashion you a gold brooch as a present for your wife if that was what you were seeking. As for making you a statue of yourself on horseback, to adorn the great square of a city over which you ruled, why, it was as easy to do that as to paint your portrait. Chief among these universal geniuses, as we should call them, was one Leonardo, son of a Florentine notary or lawyer, Piero da Vinci. He was born in the year 1452, not far from Florence and near the river Arno, and was declared by everyone to be one of the most beautiful children that ever was seen. As soon as he could crawl, he would scramble away, if his mother was not busy and not thinking about him, to a place in the garden where there was always a heap of mud after a shower of rain, and sit happily on the ground, pinching the mud into some sort of shape, which, as he grew older, took more and more the form of something he knew. When his mother missed him and came in search of him, he would utter screams of disgust. Then the only way to quiet him was to play to him on the lute, for throughout his life Leonardo loved music, and at one time even had serious thoughts of being a professional musician. Ser Piero was very proud of his astonishing little son, and the boy was still very young when his father decided that he might be taught by the best masters that could be found for him. Leonardo was quite willing. Lessons were no trouble to him, and he speedily took away the breath of all his teachers by the amazing quickness with which he grasped everything. It did not matter if the subject was arithmetic, or the principles of music, or the study of geometry. It was enough for the boy to hear a thing once, for him to understand and remember, and he constantly asked his master such difficult questions, and expressed doubts so hard to explain, the poor man was thankful indeed when school hours were ended. But whatever lessons he might be doing, Leonardo spent most of his spare time in drawing and in modeling figures in clay, as he had done from his babyhood. His father watched him for a time in silence, wondering within himself which of the boy's many talents ought to be made the occupation of his life, and at length he decided to take Leonardo to his friend, Andrea del Verrocchio, and consult him on the matter. Verrocchio, like his pupil, was a painter, a geometrician, a sculptor, a goldsmith, and a musician, but had at last settled down as a sculptor, and only now and then amused himself with other arts. When father and son entered his studio or workshop, Piero gave Leonardo some clay, and bade him model anything he fancied. The boy sat on the floor, and soon finished a tiny statuette which might have been the work of Verrocchio himself, so true to life was the figure. The sculptor was delighted, and declared that Leonardo must come to him, and that he was very sure the pupil would shortly know as much as the master. But though he had the gift of genius, Leonardo took as much trouble with his work as if he had just been an ordinary child, with his whole future life depending on his industry. And as some of you are perhaps fond of drawing, you may like to hear how one of the greatest artists in the world set about his pictures. First, he took a handful of clay and poked it and pinched it until he had got his figure exactly as he wanted it to be. Then he dipped the pieces of soft material in plaster and arranged them in folds over the naked figure. Often the stuff was too stiff and would not go in the proper lines, but long ago Leonardo had learned that no man could be the artist of any kind unless he was possessed of endless patience, and he would sit for hours over his figure, taking the drapery off and trying it afresh, till at length it assumed exactly the right shape. As soon as he had a model precisely to his mind, he would stretch a bit of very fine cambric or linen that was old and soft upon a board, and on this, or sometimes on paper, he would copy his figure in pencil. As he grew older, Verrocchio would teach him how you could raise heavy weights by the help of levers or cranes, how to draw up water from immense depths, or how to tunnel through mountains, for the Italians have always been famous for their skill as engineers. But it was the boy Leonardo, and not the man Verrocchio, who invented the plan of so altering the course of the river Arno that a canal might be cut between the cities of Florence and Pisa. Leonardo did not live to see this done, but 200 years after his death, a pupil of the astronomer Galileo executed it after his scheme for the Medici ruler of Florence. He was very anxious also to raise the church of San Giovanni, and to rest it on stone steps, as he called them, and showed the signory, or governing citizens of Florence, how it could be done. And, says his chronicler, so persuasive was his tongue, and so good seemed his reasons, that while he was speaking he moved them to belief in his words, although out of his presence they all knew well it was impossible. Was it? One wonders now. Many stories, of course, were told of him during these years, for the Florentines were not slow to find out the genius who dwelt among them, and here is one that is very characteristic of the boy. Verrocchio was working on a picture of the baptism of our Lord by St. John, and he entrusted the painting of the angel standing by to his pupil. When it was finished, the master came and looked at it, and remained silently gazing at the figure. He was too true an artist not to feel at once that he and Leonardo had changed places, and that the boy's angel was worth more than the rest of the picture. The chronicler tells us that he was so wounded at this discovery that he never touched paint any more. But though it is always rather hard to find ourselves thrown into the shade, probably Verrocchio's renunciation of painting lay deeper than mere envy. Why should he do so badly what another could do perfectly? The boy's genius was greater than his. Let his master be the first to admit it. Leonardo's father, Ser Piero, had gone to his country house to escape the heats of a Florentine summer. He was resting one evening in his garden when a servant appeared, saying that one of his farmers desired to speak with him. Ser Piero gave orders that the man should be brought to him, as he knew him well, and they had often fished together. "Well, what now, Francisco?" he asked, as the farmer came up bowing, and bearing in his hands a wooden shield. The man explained that he had cut down a fig tree near his house, because it was old and bore no fruit, and he had himself cut the shield he was carrying out of wood, and had brought it to his lord, humbly hoping that Ser Piero might have the goodness to get it painted with some design, for he wished to hang it up in his kitchen as a remembrance of the old tree. "Very willingly will I do so," answered Ser Piero. And when next he went to Florence, he sought out his son and handed him the shield, merely telling him to paint something on it. Leonardo happened to be busy at the moment, but as soon as he had time to examine the piece of wood, he found it was rough and ill-made, and would need much attention before it would be possible to paint it. The first thing he did was hold the shield before the fire till the fibers were softened and the crookedness could be straightened out. The surface was then planed and made smooth and covered with gypsum. So far, he had not thought about what the picture should be, but now he began to consider this important matter, and as he pondered, a look of mischief danced in his eyes. "I know, that will do," he said to himself. "The person who owns it, whoever he is, shall be as frightened as if they saw the head of Medusa, only, instead of being turned to stone, he will most likely run away." And, still smiling, Leonardo left the workshop and went to his room, taking the shield and a cloth. Then he went out into the fields and hunted about till he had collected a quantity of strange creatures, hedgehogs, lizards, tadpoles, locusts, snakes, and many others, for he knew as much about what he called natural history as he did about everything else, and could tell exactly where these animals could be found. As soon as he had collected enough, he carried them back and locked them safely in a kind of lumber room where nobody was allowed to enter but himself. He then sat down and began to place them so as to cause them to form one horrible monster, with eyes and legs everywhere. It was a long time before he could make anything horrid enough to please him. Again and again he undid his work and tried to combine his creatures differently. But at last something so terrible stared him in the face that he almost felt frightened. "That is all right, I think," he said with a laugh. "The monster is ready, but I must find a background fitting for him." Taking the shield, he painted on it a black and narrow cavern. At its mouth stood the creature without form, all eyes, all legs, all mouths. Flames poured from it on every side, and a cloud of vapor rose upward from its many nostrils. After days of hard labor, during which the animals died and filled the room with a smell from which even a boy might well be expected to shrink, Leonardo visited his father and told him he had finished the shield, which he hoped would please him, and that he might have it whenever he liked. Ser Piero was at the time engaged in superintending his harvest, but when he was free he set off to see his son. Leonardo himself answered his knock, and, showing his father into another room, begged him to wait for a few minutes while he put away his work. Then he rushed back to the studio, darkened the window a little, and carefully chose a position for the easel on which the shield was standing. "Will you come in now, father?" he said, holding open the door. But no sooner was Ser Piero within the room than he turned to fly, so terrible was the object that met his gaze. "It will do, I see," remarked Leonardo, catching him by the arm. "I wanted to make something so dreadful that men would shiver with fear at the sight of it. Take it away, I pray you, and do with it as you will. But stay, I had better wrap it first in a cloth, lest it frighten people out of their wits as you go along." Ser Piero took it, and departed without a word to his son. He really felt quite shaken from the shock he had had, and he determined that so wonderful a painting should never fall into the hands of a peasant. So he went to a shop, where he found a shield the same size as the other, bearing the device of a heart pierced by an arrow. And when he next went into the country, he bade the farmer come up to the house to receive it. "Oh, Excellency, how beautiful! How can I ever thank you for this goodness?" cried the man in delight when, after his long waiting, the shield was at last delivered to him. "I thought you would be pleased," answered Ser Piero, smiling to himself, as he pictured what would have been the face of the man before him, had he been given Leonardo's monster. But this he kept for some time, and then sold to a merchant for 100 ducats, who, in his turn, parted with it to the Duke of Milan for 3 times the price. In this way, Leonardo da Vinci grew to manhood, gaining friends as he went by his beauty and his talents, and keeping them by his sweetness of temper and his generosity. He loved all animals, especially horses, and could never see a caged bird without trying to buy it in order to set it free. The kings and popes of those days were always eager to attract artists to their courts, and vied with each other in trying to outbid rivals, and when he was very young, Leonardo received a commission from the King of Portugal to draw a design for some hangings to be copied in silk in Flanders. He painted an immense number of portraits, some to please himself, and others ordered by his friends, and decorated, either with painting or sculpture, a great many churches and other buildings. 2 of his pictures, at any rate, you may perhaps know from engravings of them: the portrait of Francesco del Giocondo's wife, bought by Francis I and lately stolen from the Louvre, and the Last Supper, painted for the Dominican monks in Milan, and now almost ruined by the damp. Leonardo was 41 when he was invited to go to Milan by the celebrated Lodovico Sforza, uncle to the reigning duke. Knowing that Lodovico, Il Moro as he was called, had a passion for music, the painter constructed with his own hands a silver instrument shaped like a horse's head, to which he sang tunes invented by himself, to words made up as he went along. This delighted Lodovico, and also his wife, the younger daughter of the Duke of Ferrara, who had been brought up amongst musicians and poets. Those were gay days at Milan, when all did their best to produce some form of beauty, and everybody's best was so very good. But dark days were soon to follow, and in a great measure they were the work of Lodovico himself. The French, on one excuse or another, were trying hard to get a footing in Italy. Louis XII even laid claim to the Duchy of Milan. Then came his cousin and successor Francis I, whom, in the hope of gaining his favor, Lodovico particularly wished to honor. "What can you invent, Messer Leonardo?" Lodovico asked the painter. "I want something no one has ever seen before. The king must be tired of grand shows, and he can get them at home. Of course we shall be obliged to give him a splendid reception for the sake of our own credit, but I should like something besides, which he can remember." So Messer Leonardo thought and thought, and the end of his thinking was that when the King of France entered Milan, a lion, life-size, advanced to meet him, and touched the king's breast with his own. By means of a spring, the lion's breast opened, and from it fell sheaves of white lilies, the emblem of France. Then, too, the other Italian princes wished to employ him and make use of his varied talents. One of the Borgias sent him around the various cities over which he ruled to inspect their fortifications, and to see what new engineering works were needed to withstand the constant sieges and the wars of state with state. Naturally, the cardinals would not remain behindhand, especially those of the Medici family, Leonardo's own countrymen, and hearing that his kinsman Giuliano had induced the artist to travel to Rome in his train, Leo X sent for him, and after a long talk on many subjects, expressed a desire to know if the painter was able to make figures that would fly. The idea delighted Leonardo, and he instantly set about some experiments. After many failures, he at length succeeded in producing a kind of paste out of wax, and when it was still half melted, he modelled some little horses and dogs and lions, scooping out the wax till only a very thin outer covering was left, all the rest being hollow. Into the figures he managed to blow some air, and as long as the air was in them, they flew about to the joy and surprise of everyone, but when it was all exhausted, the horses and dogs and lions came tumbling on the floor, one on top of another. Another day, when the talk had turned on feats of strength, somebody inquired whether what he had been told was true, that Leonardo was stronger than any man in Florence. "Here I am, try me," answered the painter. "We will," they all cried, and sent a servant for a horseshoe, and for an iron ring such as used for door-knockers. "Now see if you can bend these," they said, and Leonardo took them, and bent them as easily as Samson broke the ropes of the Philistines. The last few years of his life Leonardo passed in France, where Francis I was now king. Many of his pictures were already there, and there were others which Francis desired him to paint. But the artist was tired and ill, and made all sorts of excuses to avoid beginning his work. At last he told the king, who frequently came to visit him, that it was time he left the things of this world, and turned his thoughts to the other which he would soon enter. His words were repeated sorrowfully among his friends, and though they fain would have denied their truth, yet they could not. So, in May 1519 he died, leaving behind him a memory that will live while painting endures. But he was mourned not only on account of his many talents and splendid works of all sorts, but for the beauty of his face, which lasted till his death, his merry words that lightened the burdens of those who were sad, and his kindness and generosity to all who stood in need of help and comfort. End of chapter 33. The Boyhood of a Painter.
Chapter 34 of The Strange Storybook. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Christine Lehman, Reseda, California. The Strange Storybook by Mrs. Lang. Chapter 34. The Adventures of a Spanish Nun. If you had visited the convent of St. Sebastian in the Spanish town of the same name at the end of the 16th century, you would have found there a merry, naughty, clever little girl called Catalina de Erauso, the torment and delight of all the nuns. Catalina had been sent to the convent when she was quite a baby, because her father, like many other gentlemen in the Spain of those days, was too poor to provide for his daughters as well as his sons, and in general the girls were happy enough in the life into which they had been thrust without any will of their own, and were allowed a certain amount of pleasure, and could see their relations from time to time. The Señor de Erauso, Catalina's father, had fixed on this particular convent out of the many he had for choice, because his sister-in-law was the Mother Superior. Like the rest of the nuns, she was very fond of the child, who was so ready with her tongue, so clever with her hands, so quick to forgive an injury done her, if only the offender would say she was sorry. Some day, no doubt, Catalina would take her place as abbess, and her aunt felt that under her rule all would go well, for unruly as the child often was, she had the gift of winning love from everybody. But if she had only known, Catalina had not the smallest intention of spending her days in the convent overlooking the Bay of Biscay. From her father and brothers she heard stories of the wars which had quite lately been raging in France between the Catholics and the Huguenots, how a few years earlier several of her own kinsmen had gone down in the great storm which had sunk so many of the ships of the huge armada sent to conquer England. Something, too, she picked up of the wonders of the lands beyond the ocean, discovered 100 years ago by Christopher Columbus. All this and much more Catalina stored in her head, and, though she said nothing even to her closest friends, soon began to play in her mind at escaping from the convent. At first she was only in fun, and enjoyed, as many of us do, making up stories about herself. Then, gradually, the idea of taking part in the big world beyond the gates became too precious to set aside, and at last it so possessed her that she only waited for the chance of carrying it out. This happened when she was 15, a tall, strong, handsome girl, full of energy and courage, and quick to decide whatever question came before her. One day the nuns assembled as usual for vespers or evening prayers, and just as they were all going into chapel, the superior discovered that she had left her psalm book upstairs, locked in her writing table. Summoning Katharina, she handed her a key and bade her unlock the drawer in which the book was kept and bring it to her as fast as possible. The girl ran upstairs, but when she saw lying in the locked drawer not only the book but the key of the convent gate, it darted into her mind that now, if ever, was her opportunity to quit the convent. Yet, even at that moment, she did not let her excitement get the better of her. She snatched up some loose money from the drawer and a small work case that lay on a table and hid it in her dress, and without stopping a moment ran down to the great door of the convent, which she unlocked. She next rejoined her aunt, who was waiting for her, and asked if she might go straight to bed, as she had a bad headache. In this manner she secured to herself a good start, as no one would think about her for hours to come. She passed through the door carefully, locking it after her, and crept cautiously along by the wall till she reached a chestnut wood on the outskirts of the town. Here she flung herself down on a heap of dry leaves and slept till sunrise. This, fortunately for her, was very early, as she had much to do before she continued her journey. Her dress would have told any passer-by that she was a nun, or at least that she had come from a convent, and that was the last thing they must ever guess. Slipping off, therefore, her white petticoat, Katharina began at once to turn it into trousers such as men then wore, and in 3 or 4 hours had finished a pair which, if not exactly fashionable, would pass unnoticed. She next managed to change her long robe into a cloak, and satisfied that she would do well enough, the girl started on a walk to a town not far off, where she had resolved to try and find shelter with an elderly cousin. It took her 2 days to arrive at his house, and all that time she had nothing but wild fruits and berries to live on. Of course she did not tell the cousin who she was, but merely asked if he would give hospitality to a traveler for a short time, which the kind old man was glad to do. Here Katharina rested after the fatigues she had undergone, but life in the town house was far more dull than life in the convent, and the girl had not run away for that. So in a few days she was again missing, and a handful of dollars also. Not very many, but just enough to take her on her way. We meet Katharina next in the famous city of Valladolid, where King Philip III was holding his court. Here she found things much more to her taste, and like what she had pictured. Men were walking through the streets in huge felt hats, with flowing cloaks over their fine clothes. Coaches drawn by mules jolted along, and inside she caught a glimpse of ringleted heads and small bodies lost under hooped petticoats. There were soldiers, too, in abundance, and bands playing music, the first Katharina had ever heard outside the convent chapel. It so delighted her that she stopped to listen, and at that moment some idle men began to laugh at her clumsy garments, and even threw stones at her. This was more than any Spanish girl could bear, even if she had been brought up in a convent. She could, and did, throw stones too, with a better aim than theirs, and very soon blood from cut heads was streaming on the roads. But the Spanish police who hurried to the spot on hearing the cries of the wounded men did not stop to inquire into the rights of the quarrel, and would have straightway flung Katharina into prison had not a young officer who had been watching the fight from his windows hastened to interfere, and insisted that the stranger should be released. "You are a brave boy," he said, "and if you like to be my page, I will gladly take you into my house." Katharina was grateful for the offer and remained there for 3 months, feeling very proud of herself in her page's dress of dark blue velvet. She would have stayed with the young Don for much longer had she not been frightened out of her wits one night at dusk by the appearance, in the dark little anteroom where she sat, of her own father. He did not know her, of course. How should he? But all the same, he had come to tell of her escape to Catalina's master, who was in a sort of way lord of the convent. Waiting in the anteroom, the girl heard all their conversation, and in dread lest she should fall into the hands of the church and be sent back to St. Sebastian, she resolved to run off before there was any risk of her being traced. Now at that time a fleet was being fitted out for Peru, and was to sail from a seaport in the south. The scraps of talk on the subject which she had overheard in the house of the young Don had fired her with the wish to go with the army in search of adventures. At the time there seemed little chance of her doing so, but while crossing the dark streets of Valladolid in her flight, the idea occurred to her that if she could manage to get on board one of the ships, she would be out of reach of capture. It was a long way to travel, almost the whole length of Spain, but by joining first one party and then another, Catalina at last found herself in the port of Sanlúcar. All volunteers were welcome, and convent-bred though she was, Catalina soon managed to pick up a good deal of seamanship, while her clever hands and her strength combined made her quickly useful. Even with fair winds it was months before they reached the coast of Peru, for which they were bound, and when they were almost there, their troubles began. A frightful storm arose that blew the fleet in all directions, and the vessel in which Catalina was serving was flung on a coral reef. The sea was running high, and the ship had a deep hole in her side, and all on board knew that 24 hours at farthest would see her sucked beneath the water. At the prospect of this awful doom the sailors grew frantic, and hastened to lower the longboat and scramble into it. The captain alone refused to leave the ship, and Catalina refused to leave him. Instead, she hurriedly lashed a few spars together so as to form a raft which, even if it would not support the weight of both, would at least give them something to cling to while they swam ashore. As she was working at the raft with all her might, a vivid flash of lightning showed an enormous wave breaking over the distant boat and sweeping away the crew, who disappeared forever. A fit of despondency had seized on the captain, and it was in vain that the girl tried to put some of her own spirit into him. At length she realized that she had only herself to depend on, and left him alone. As soon as the raft was ready, she went down to his cabin and broke open a box of gold, out of which she took a handful of coins, tying them up in a pillow-case and fastening them securely to the raft, for she dared not put them on her own person, lest the weight should sink her when once she found herself in the sea. The moment Catalina appeared again on deck, she saw that the ship was sinking fast, and that no time was to be lost. She lowered the raft and, calling to the captain to follow her, plunged into the sea. He obeyed her, but did not give the vessel a sufficiently wide berth, and, falling against a jutting spar, was struck senseless and sucked under the vessel. Catalina had managed better. She contrived to get on the raft, and was gently washed on shore by the rising tide, though she was too much exhausted by all she had gone through to have been able to swim there for herself. For a while she lay upon the sand almost unconscious, but the hot sun which appeared suddenly above the horizon warmed her body and dried her clothes, and awoke her usual energy. She soon sat up and looked about her, but the prospect was not cheering. A desolate tract stretched away north and south, and she did not know on which side stood the town of Paita, whither the fleet had been bound. However, she reflected she would never find it by sitting still, and got up and climbed a rock to enable her to see farther. Great was her joy at beholding that the raft, with the money on it, had stuck in a cleft some way off along the beach, and after she had placed the coins in her own pockets, she perceived a barrel of ship's biscuits at a little distance. To be sure, the biscuits were half soaked with sea-water, but even so they tasted quite nice to a starving girl. A walk of 3 days brought her to Paita, where she bought some fresh clothes and obtained a situation as clerk to a merchant. But she did not keep this very long, as she incurred the jealousy of a young man who owed money to her employer. He picked a violent quarrel with Catalina, who had to fight a duel with him. Without intending to kill him, her sword passed through his body, with the result that she soon found herself in the hands of the police. By a mixture of cunning and good fortune, Catalina managed to escape from the prison in which she was confined, and, making her way through the narrow streets to the harbor, she got into a small boat moored there and hoisted a sail. She was afraid to use the oars, as she had no means of muffling them. The wind was behind her, and she was quickly swept far out to sea. In what direction she had not the least idea. For hours she saw nothing, and was wondering if she had escaped so many dangers only to die of hunger and thirst, when, towards sunset, she beheld a ship coming straight across her path. With her heart in her mouth she waved her handkerchief, though it seemed hardly possible that so small a thing should be visible in that vast expanse of sea. But it was, and the ship lay to, waiting for the boat to be blown up to her, which happened just after the sun had set beneath the horizon, and the short twilight of the tropics was over. Then it occurred to Catalina that if the name of her boat was seen, she might be traced as having come from Paita, and be given up for murder. So, standing up, she rocked it gently from side to side till it was filled with water. Then, giving it a final kick to make sure it would sink, snatched at the rope which was dangling down the ship's side, and was hauled on board. The vessel was on her way to Chile, and was filled with recruits for the war then raging with the Indians, and Catalina of course at once declared her wish to throw in her lot with them. When at length they arrived at the port for which they were bound, a cavalry officer came to inspect the newly enlisted soldiers before they were landed, and Catalina was startled to hear him addressed by her own name. It was, though he was quite unaware of it, her eldest brother, who had last seen her when she was 3 years old. Yet, though from first to last he never guessed the truth, he took an immediate fancy to Pedro Diaz, for so Catalina called herself, and as soon as he heard that Pedro was a native of his own province of Biscaya, greeted him kindly and placed him in his own regiment. But much as she longed to tell him who she was, she dared not do so, for who could tell, if it were once known that she was a woman and had run away from a convent, what the consequences might be. Years passed away, and Catalina, or Pedro Diaz, had distinguished herself on many occasions as a cavalry officer. Then a terrible thing occurred. A lieutenant in her own regiment came to her and begged her to be his second in a duel to be fought at 11 that night under the walls of a monastery. Catalina, though ready enough with her own sword if her hot temper was roused, had no fancy for dueling, and somehow felt more than usually unwilling to be mixed up with this affair. However, the young man begged her so earnestly not to refuse his request that at last she consented. When the moment arrived, it was so dark that the 2 principals were forced to tie white handkerchiefs round their arms in order to see where to attack, and as they were afraid of arousing the attention of the monks, hardly a word was spoken. The signal was given by the other second, and the duel began, a duel to the death. After a sharp struggle, both principals fell to the ground, wounded mortally, and according to the code of honor, which lasted nearly 100 years longer, it was necessary for the seconds to fight in order to avenge them. To Catalina, who had no quarrel with anyone, this custom was hateful, and she tried only to defend herself without touching her adversary. But in the dark her foot slipped, and the point of her sword entered his side. "Villain, you have killed me!" he cried. They were his last words, and the voice that uttered them was the voice of Catalina's brother. Too much horrified to stir, The poor woman remained glued to the spot, till she found herself suddenly seized by the monks, who had been awakened by the clash of weapons and by de Erauso's dying shriek. The glare of their torches revealed that out of the 4 men who had met on the ground half an hour earlier, only one survived, and that one was too crushed by the dreadful fate which had befallen her to be able to give any explanation. The monks kept her safely in their chapel for a few days, and then, when her mind and body had partly recovered from the shock, they provided her with a horse and a knapsack filled with food, and bade her farewell. But where to go she knew not. After the awful thing that had happened, she could never return to her regiment. After 3 days' riding she came suddenly upon 2 soldiers who had deserted from the Spanish army and were almost starving. As soon as Catalina had shared her food with them and they felt revived, they all agreed that their best plan was to climb over the great mountain chain of the Andes, which runs the whole length of South America, and once on the other side they would be safe and free to go where they would. They little knew what they were undertaking. Many of the peaks are over 20,000 feet high, and are covered with perpetual snow. There was rarely to be found any material for a fire, and if by chance they did come on a few sticks, they were ignorant of the Indians' secret of kindling a flame. Soon even the wild berries of the lower regions were left behind. There was nothing for them to eat, and very shortly it became evident that the day of the deserters was done. By this time they were among masses of rocks which stood out in black groups from the snow, and for an instant hope rose again in their hearts at the sight of a man leaning against a tall pillar of stone with a gun in his hand. There was something to shoot then in this fearful white solitude, an eagle perhaps, or, better still, a bear, and with a cry of joy to her companions, Catalina hastened on to greet the stranger. At the news, fresh life seemed to pour into their veins, and they stumbled after her as fast as their weakness would allow. They were a little surprised to see that the man never appeared to see or hear them as they approached, but imagined that the snow had deadened the sound of their footsteps. Was he asleep? In that position? It was not likely. Certainly there was something very odd about him, and Catalina, striding on before the 2 soldiers, touched him on the shoulder. With a clatter the gun fell to the ground beside him, but he himself did not stir. Then the frightful truth burst upon her. The man was frozen to death. After this there was no more hope for the 2 deserters. One sank into the snow first, the other staggered a few yards farther, and upon both came the frozen sleep that knows no waking, and which, it is said, is painless. So Catalina was left to pursue her way alone, wondering all the while how soon her strength also would fail her, and her bones be left to whiten with the rest. There was something more dreadful to her in the solitude and stillness of the mountains than there ever had been in the solitude of the sea on the lonely coast of Peru. Yet she went on blindly, almost unconsciously, till she was awakened from her half-paralyzed state by the sight of a belt of olive trees lying below her. Where there were trees, there was probably water, possibly even men, and down she went, stumbling over stones, sliding along the edge of precipices, till she fell, senseless from exhaustion, under their shadow. It was hours before she came to herself again, and she might have slept on still longer had not the sound of horses' hoofs aroused her. The wood was thick, and the horseman might have passed without noticing the figure in the tall grass, had not a ray of sunshine suddenly struck on some silver lace of Catalina's uniform. Jumping instantly to the ground, they examined her closely and guessed at the reasons of her plight. Taking out a skin bottle, one poured brandy down her throat, though it was no light matter to force her teeth open, and another rubbed her temples. After she had shown signs of life, they placed her on a horse, supporting her in the saddle, for she was still too weak and dazed to sit upright. It was a long time, or so it seemed to Catalina, before the little company drew up at the door of a large house, and a girl ran out to see how it was that the servants, who had been sent by her mother to the nearest town, should have returned so soon. The poor wanderer received from both ladies the kindest welcome, and food, a warm bed, and rest soon set her to rights, and of course nobody dreamed that she was anything but the soldier she appeared. For a while Catalina was thankful to remain where she was, basking in the sun and enjoying the company of the señora and her daughter. It was the first time since she left Valladolid that she had ever been inside a home. Yet, grateful as she was for all the kindness shown her, Catalina felt she could not remain forever a guest of the widowed señora, and she was glad when the lady proposed that they should all visit a large town lying to the south for purposes of business. And, Catalina thought to herself, it will be easy for me, when I am once there, to invent some excuse for bidding them farewell. I cannot pass my life in a hammock under trees, thankful though I am for the rest which has been given me. But she did not guess that the excuse she wanted was to be obtained only at the risk of her own neck. Wandering about the town, she fell in with some Portuguese, and as she was fond of cards, she was readily persuaded by them to sit down and gamble. Very soon her suspicions were roused that they were not playing fair, and she watched them more closely. Yes, I was sure of it, she thought, and grew so angry that she would have liked to challenge the whole 12 on the spot. Luckily, she contrived with great difficulty to restrain herself, and resolved only to fight the man who had won most of her money. When this person left the gambling saloon, Catalina kept him in sight, but did not attempt to speak to him till she saw him stop before one of the houses in a dark street. Then she quickened her steps, and, tapping him on the shoulder, remarked, "Señor, you are a robber." "It is possible," answered the Portuguese, turning coolly, "but I don't care about being told so," and drew his sword. Catalina drew hers, and, after a quick sharp fight, dealt him a mortal blow. As he fell, she looked round hastily, fearing that some of his friends might be at hand to avenge him, but all was silent. Satisfied that nobody was watching her, she tried the door, which opened instantly, and dragged the body into the passage. This done, she went back to the señora's house, and getting into bed slept soundly, only awakening the following morning to find her room filled with police. Catalina never knew exactly how her fight with the dead man had been discovered, and as she was instantly put in prison to await her trial, perhaps it did not much matter. False witnesses were easily found, who trumped up a story of vengeance, and it was useless for Catalina to swear that she had never seen the Portuguese gentleman till that evening, and knew nothing at all about him. The fact that the dead man was a native of the place, while she was a stranger, told heavily against her, and sentence was passed that she should be hanged in the public square in 8 days' time. Wearing her lieutenant's uniform, from which she steadily declined to be parted, Catalina walked firmly up the ladder to the gallows on the appointed day. The executioner was new to his work, and bungled the noose which he had to place round Catalina's neck. "Here, let me do it," she said at last. "It is plain you have never been at sea." But all the same, the man's clumsiness had saved her, for before he could pull the knot, an order arrived from the governor of the state to postpone the execution till fresh inquiries could be made. In the end the truth came out, and Catalina was set free, but was advised by the governor not to remain in that part of the country for the present. The advice was felt to be good by them all, but as Catalina had no money, the good señora again came to the rescue, and gave her enough to buy a horse and to take her to a large town, where she might find something to do. When at length Catalina reached the city, which bore the name of Paz or Peace, some soldiers who were lounging in the streets stood up and stared so hard at her beautiful black horse that Catalina began to suspect that something was the matter. The soldiers said nothing whatever to her, But one of them, catching sight of a gentleman a few paces off, ran up to him and whispered something. The mayor, for such he was, walked up to Catalina, who inquired if she could be of service to him. "These men," said he, "declare that the horse you are riding was stolen from them." Catalina did not answer directly, but, leaping to the ground, flung the loose saddle-cloth over the horse's head. "I bought it and paid for it in La Plata," she replied, "but if, your worship, these men really own the horse, they will be able to tell you which is its blind eye." "The left," cried one. "No, the right," exclaimed the other. "Well, it must be one of the two, mustn't it, your worship?" asked she. "No, no, we remember now," they replied, consulting each other by a glance and a sign. "It is the left, of course." "Are you sure?" she asked again. "Yes, quite sure, certain." Upon that Catalina whisked off the saddle-cloth and said gaily to the mayor, "Now, your worship, if you will take the trouble to look, you will see that the horse has nothing the matter with either eye." Then she bowed and rode away to look for a dinner. Catalina's last adventure in South America was a wild ride to the town of Cuzco, carrying on her saddle a lady whose half-mad husband was seeking to murder her. He was following fast behind, and his horse was laden with no double burden, so that in every way he had the advantage. But Catalina was a better rider, and had some start. So, in spite of a wound in her horse's flank, she won the day and placed the lady in safety in a convent. The husband, arriving just in time to see his victim escape him, at once unsheathed his sword and inflicted some severe wounds on Catalina. Indeed, had it not been for the interference of the bishop himself, it would have gone hardly with her. But when, half fainting from loss of blood, she was carried into the palace and a doctor was summoned, she knew that the moment she had dreaded had come, and that she must now confess that, in spite of all her exploits and all her daring, she was only a woman. Always prompt to make up her mind, she asked for an interview with the bishop, who listened to her tale with amazement and sympathy. By his advice she entered a convent till he could write to Spain and to the Pope, and obtain forgiveness for having thrown off her nun's habit nearly 20 years before. As soon as could be expected, though not till after many months, the answer came. Catalina was to be sent back to Spain. It was at the end of November 1624 that the ship entered the harbor of Cadiz, and saw a gilded barge approaching, rowed by men in royal livery. Who could it be intended for? There was no one on board either great or famous. At least so they thought. But it appears they were wrong, for there was one person whose adventures had thrilled the hearts of both king and people, and that was Catalina herself. As she left the barge and mounted the steps, she beheld the famous minister Olivares waiting to receive her, and crowds thronged the streets through which she passed on her way to the palace. Here she was requested to tell her story to the court, and as some reward for her courage in battle and for her loyalty to the crown, a pension for life was settled upon her. Poor Catalina felt very strange in the stiff, uncomfortable dress of a Spanish lady, and far more than her honors and her pension did she value the permission of the Pope, whom she visited at Rome a few months later, to wear on all occasions the uniform of a cavalry officer, together with a sword and spurs. For 10 years Catalina remained in Spain, leading a quiet life, and feeling, if the truth be told, terribly dull. She was 43 when she heard that an expedition to South America was again being fitted out, and she lost no time in joining the army. Oh, how happy she was to be back in the old life, where, even in the slow voyages of those times, a stirring adventure might befall you at any hour of the day or night. They sailed first to the Gulf of Mexico and stopped in the port of Vera Cruz, where the officers arranged to go on shore and have a grand dinner at the best inn in the place. Catalina was of course to go with them, and jumped into the boat with the rest, laughing and talking in the highest spirits, as if 20 years had rolled from her. In a quarter of an hour they reached the inn, but as they gathered round the table, someone inquired, "Where is Catalina?" "Catalina? Isn't she here?" was the answer. "Certainly she was in the boat, for she sat by me." "Well, but where has she gone?" Ah, that no one knew, and what is more, no one ever did know. End of chapter 34. End of the Strange Storybook by Mrs. Lang. Recording by Christine Lehman, Reseda, California.